Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm very glad you are here tonight. Find somewhere comfortable, settle into whatever position lets the day finally loosen its grip on you, and allow the noise around you to become a little less important for the next few minutes. Tonight, we are going to Los Angeles. But not the Los Angeles of movie premieres, hillside mansions, crowded beaches, and bright signs reflected in polished car windows. We're going several miles away from that familiar picture, into neighbourhoods that tourists rarely entered and television cameras usually visited only after something terrible had happened. We're going to South Central Los Angeles during the years when an ordinary residential street could become disputed territory, when the wrong colour of clothing could attract dangerous attention, and when children sometimes learned the boundaries between rival neighbourhoods before they learned the boundaries of the city itself. The title of this story calls the place Hell's Half Acre. Historically, that name is most closely associated with the notorious vice district that developed in Fort Worth, Texas during the 19th century. The Los Angeles neighbourhoods in this account did not officially carry that name. Here, it describes something residents often experienced rather than something printed on a map. A small area in which violence, fear, poverty, drugs and police pressure became concentrated until a few blocks could feel cut off from the rules governing the rest of the city. That distinction matters because South Central was never one neighbourhood, one gang, or one continuous battlefield. It contained families, schools, churches, stores, factories, parks, apartment buildings, public housing developments and quiet residential blocks. Most of the people living there were not gang members. Most were working, raising children, attending school, paying rent, helping neighbours, and trying to build stable lives. Yet during the late 1970s, the 1980s, and the opening years of the 1990s, parts of this large section of Los Angeles were pulled into an expanding conflict involving dozens of gangs and many smaller neighbourhood factions. The Crips and Bloods became the names most familiar to the outside world, but those names concealed a complicated local reality. They were not two armies directed by two headquarters. They were broad identities shared by many separate sets, each with its own territory, history, alliances, enemies, and internal disputes. Before we begin, let me ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a large city where every block has its own character? Are you somewhere quiet, where hearing a car after midnight is unusual? Perhaps you grew up in a place where adults warned you not to cross a certain street, enter a certain park, or take a certain route home. Maybe the danger was real, maybe it was exaggerated, or perhaps you had the privilege of moving through your neighbourhood without ever wondering whether someone might demand to know where you came from. That question, where are you from, can be casual. It can begin a friendship. It can help two strangers discover that they attended the same school or knew the same family. In some Los Angeles neighbourhoods during this period, however, it could also be a threat. Where you lived could determine how strangers identified you. The street behind your apartment, the housing project near your school, the park where you played basketball, or the people standing beside you could place you inside a conflict, even when you had never chosen to join it. A short walk to a shop could take you across an invisible border. A bus ride could carry a student through several rival territories. An address could become an accusation. Stay with me tonight because this is not simply a story about famous gangs, drug dealers, police officers or riots. It is about what happened when years of segregation, disappearing employment, political neglect, neighbourhood rivalry, aggressive policing, narcotics markets, and widely available firearms converged in the same place. It is also about the people who had to live inside that convergence. If this kind of detailed history speaks to you, and you appreciate stories that slow down long enough to look beyond the headlines, you can support the channel by subscribing and giving the video a like. There is no hurry. You can decide later when something in the story stays with you, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. I genuinely enjoy seeing how far these histories travel. For now, let's return to Los Angeles near the end of the 1970s. Imagine that it is early evening in the southern part of the city. The heat of the afternoon is beginning to fade, although the pavement still holds some of it. Cars move along broad streets lined with small businesses, gas stations, take-out restaurants, liquor stores, churches, vacant lots, and houses set behind low fences. Somewhere a radio is playing through an open window. Children are finishing a game before being called inside. A city bus pulls to the curb, releases several passengers, and moves on. Nothing about the scene announces that history is changing. There is no single day on which South Central suddenly becomes dangerous. There is no official declaration, no line painted across the road, and no moment when every resident understands that an older pattern of neighbourhood conflict is giving way to something larger. Instead, the change arrives unevenly. A fight between young men becomes a feud between groups. A feud produces retaliation. Retaliation produces another funeral. The death creates a new obligation among friends who believe that failing to answer violence will invite more of it. The next attack may involve someone only loosely connected to the original dispute. Then another neighbourhood becomes involved. A group divides, and the new faction inherits enemies it did not personally create. Younger members learn the history in fragments, often from people who were not present when the conflict began. Before long, nobody can clearly explain the first cause, but everyone knows the latest death. The Crips had emerged in Los Angeles around the end of the 1960s, most commonly associated with Raymond Washington and later Stanley Tookie Williams. As the Crip identity spread during the 1970s, it did not produce a single centralized organization. Neighborhood groups adopted the name while continuing to operate locally. Some joined because the identity offered power, recognition, or protection. Others were absorbed through pressure or alliance. Groups that resisted Crip expansion increasingly organized against it, and alliances including the Pyrus and Brims became associated with the blood identity. It is tempting to describe this history as though two groups appeared and immediately began fighting over the entire city. That version is easy to follow, but it is misleading. Los Angeles gang life had existed before the Crips and Bloods. Earlier, black youth groups grew from social clubs, neighborhood associations, school rivalries, car clubs, parties, and local defense. Some fought, some committed crimes, some existed partly because young people wanted identity and companionship in communities where public institutions offered limited space, recreation, or security. The later Crip and Blood alignments reorganized much of that local world, but they did not create neighborhood rivalry from nothing. The city around them was changing as well. For much of the 20th century, black families in Los Angeles had faced housing discrimination that restricted where they could buy or rent. Racially restrictive covenants, discriminatory lending, intimidation, and informal real estate practices had helped concentrate black residents in particular parts of the city. Even after explicit legal barriers weakened, their effects remained visible in neighborhood wealth, school resources, property ownership, and access to opportunity. At the same time, many of the industrial jobs that had drawn black workers to Los Angeles during and after the Second World War began disappearing or moving. Manufacturing plants closed, reduced their workforces, or relocated. Stable jobs that had once offered a path into the working class became harder to obtain, especially for young people entering adulthood without strong connections, transportation, or advanced education. This did not mean that every household was poor or that every young man was unemployed. South Central included homeowners, public employees, business owners, skilled workers, teachers, nurses, postal workers, mechanics, and families with deep roots in the city. But when employment disappears from a neighborhood, the effect is not limited to the people who lose a paycheck. Local businesses lose customers. Families take on more debt. Young adults remain financially dependent longer. Buildings receive fewer repairs. Public spaces deteriorate. People who can afford to leave may do so, taking money and political influence with them. Those who remain are expected to solve increasingly complicated problems with fewer resources. Gangs did not arise simply because people were poor. Most poor people did not join gangs, and poverty alone does not explain why violence takes a particular form. But concentrated disadvantage created conditions in which a neighbourhood group could offer things that formal institutions often failed to provide: identity, status, protection, income, companionship, and a reputation that discouraged outsiders from treating its members as easy targets. The protection could quickly become another source of danger. A teenager might join because he feared a nearby gang, only to become visible to that gang because he had joined. Carrying a weapon might feel like protection, until an argument that once ended with bruises ended with a death. A group created to defend one street might attack another street to demonstrate strength. The action produced the very retaliation its members claimed they were preparing to resist. This is one of the hardest parts of the story to understand from outside. People often ask why someone would join a group that made his life more dangerous. The question assumes that safety was available somewhere else. For some young people it was. For others, the alternatives did not feel convincing. Refusing affiliation did not guarantee neutrality. Living in a particular housing development, having relatives in a gang, attending a certain school, or spending time with certain friends could be enough for rivals to assign an identity to you. You did not always choose the map. Sometimes the map chose you. By the end of the 1970s, the broad labels were breaking into an expanding collection of local sets. Even groups sharing the Crip identity could become enemies. Blood sets could have their own rivalries. Alliances shifted. Personal disputes became neighbourhood disputes, and neighbourhood disputes became traditions inherited by people too young to remember their beginnings. The language of territory made this world sound almost military. People spoke of turf, borders, enemies, allies, attacks, retaliation, and defence. Yet the disputed ground was not an empty battlefield. It was where people lived. The border might run beside a grandmother's house. The contested corner might be where residents waited for the bus. The street claimed by one set might contain families connected by marriage to people living in a rival area. A school could draw students from several neighbourhoods whose conflicts entered the gates with them each morning. Teachers and administrators were left to manage tensions formed far beyond the classroom. Parents who could not move had to teach children how to avoid trouble without frightening them so deeply that they became afraid of everyone. Consider what this meant for an ordinary family. A mother hears gunshots several blocks away. She does not know who fired them or why. She calls her children inside anyway. Later, a police helicopter begins circling, its spotlight passing across rooftops and windows. Patrol cars move through the area. Officers stop young men who appear to match a description, which may be precise or may amount to little more than age, race, clothing, and location. Her oldest son is not a gang member, but she worries about him being mistaken for one by both sides. Gang members may interpret where he walks, whom he knows, or what he wears. Police officers may do the same. He can be questioned by people on the street and stopped by officers before he reaches home. The family's fear does not come from one direction. It comes from the possibility that every authority operating outside the house may misunderstand him. By the early 1980s, another force was entering the picture. Cocaine had been present in Los Angeles for years, but new forms of smokable cocaine began spreading through neighbourhoods. Crack was cheap by the dose, fast in its effect, and capable of generating repeated sales. The market grew rapidly between 1983 and 1985. One contemporary study found that cocaine sale arrests in South Central rose by 375% during those years. Importantly, that same research warned against the simple claim that gangs controlled the entire early crack trade. The expansion of sales was not initially dominated by identified gang members. That complication is worth remembering. Later accounts often compress the period into a clean sequence. Gangs appeared, crack arrived, gangs sold crack, and violence exploded. history rarely moves so neatly. Independent dealers participated. Gang members did not all sell drugs. Sets varied in their involvement. Drug alliances could cross older rivalries, while personal conflicts could disrupt profitable arrangements. Some gang members made substantial money, many did not. The public image of organised criminal armies was often more coherent than the reality on the ground. Still, the drug market changed the scale of what was possible. Money entered some street organisations in quantities that had not been available through earlier crimes. Dealers could purchase cars, weapons, legal assistance, and loyalty. A profitable selling location became worth defending. Disputes that once concerned reputation now involved income. The loss of a corner or an apartment used for sales could mean the loss of hundreds or thousands of dollars. Firearms increased the consequences. Guns had always existed in Los Angeles, and shootings were not new. But as more participants carried weapons, confrontations became more likely to turn fatal. A fistfight requires people to remain close. A shooting can happen from a car and be over in seconds. The attacker may not see clearly who is standing nearby. The victim may not be the intended target. Witnesses may remember only the vehicle, the sound, and the direction in which it disappeared. The drive-by shooting became one of the defining fears of the period because it transformed an ordinary street into a place where violence could arrive without warning. Someone could be talking beside a parked car. Someone could be walking home with groceries. Children could be playing in a front yard. Then headlights slowed, a window lowered, and a dispute involving a handful of people endangered everyone within range. The next day, television reports might reduce the event to a few sentences. A suspected gang-related shooting, 1 dead, 2 wounded, no arrests. Viewers elsewhere in the city heard another piece of evidence that South Central was violent. Residents heard the name of a street they used every day. That difference shaped how Los Angeles understood itself. To outsiders, the area became a symbol. To residents, it remained home. People still celebrated birthdays, attended church, repaired cars, argued over bills, watched television, cooked dinner, fell in love, studied for exams, and left early for work. Neighbourhood life did not stop when violence increased. It adapted. Parents changed routes. Stores installed barriers. Residents learned which sounds required them to move away from a window. Children learned when adults were trying not to show fear. The police adapted too, and their response would become one of the most controversial parts of the story. The Los Angeles Police Department had created specialized anti-gang units known as CRASH, Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums, during the late 1970s as gang activity became a greater public concern. The units collected intelligence, tracked suspected members, conducted stops, and carried out enforcement operations in neighborhoods identified as gang territory. To many frightened residents, the police were necessary. They wanted officers to stop shootings, remove armed offenders, and restore streets that belonged to the whole community. Families who had lost children to gang violence did not experience enforcement as an academic debate. They wanted the killers found. But methods mattered. Frequent stops, broad gang labelling, aggressive searches, damaged property, verbal abuse, and the treatment of entire neighbourhoods as hostile territory deepened distrust. People could fear gangs and still resent the police. They could demand protection and still believe officers treated them unfairly. Those positions were not contradictory. They were the daily reality of communities caught between armed groups and a department that often approached them as a problem to be controlled. During the coming years, that pressure would intensify. Crack markets would spread. Gang sets would multiply and fragment. Weapons would become more common. Drive-by shootings would turn retaliation into a cycle that could cross several neighbourhoods in a single night. Police operations would grow larger and more forceful. Homicides would rise. Funerals would become familiar, and an entire generation of young people would be discussed in public as though it consisted only of predators and victims. Yet none of that was inevitable on this early evening near the end of the 1970s. The children outside do not know what the next decade will bring. The adults calling them home cannot see the statistics that will later be used to describe their community. The young men gathering near the corner do not imagine that local identities will eventually be recognised across the country and exported far beyond California. For the moment, the street still looks ordinary. That is where we need to remain for a little while, because the transformation of South Central cannot be understood by beginning with crack cocaine, automatic weapons, or the violence of the late 1980s. By then, the structure was already in place. The neighbourhoods had already been divided by older political decisions. Trust in law enforcement had already been damaged by decades of conflict. Youth groups had already been forming, disappearing, merging, and fighting for years. The names would change, the scale would change, the number of guns would change, the amount of money would change. But beneath all of it was an older question that had followed Los Angeles through much of the 20th century. What happens when a city contains communities that are close enough to supply its workers, but distant enough to be neglected when those workers need investment, fair policing, stable schools, and political power? To understand how residential blocks became contested ground, we must go back before the most famous gang names, before the crack houses, before the police battering rams, and before the helicopters became part of the nighttime soundscape. We need to look at how Los Angeles built its boundaries, how black families were directed into particular neighbourhoods, how earlier youth clubs changed as the city changed around them, and why a generation coming of age after the political movements of the 1960s found fewer institutions prepared to receive it. That story begins not with a gunshot, but with a map. The map we need to examine is not the kind sold at a gas station. It does not show highways, tourist attractions, or the quickest route to the beach. It is a map created by housing contracts, lending decisions, factory locations, school boundaries, police practices, and thousands of private choices shaped by race. To understand how parts of South Central Los Angeles became heavily contested territory, we have to begin with a fact that is easy to overlook. The neighbourhoods where the Crips and Bloods later developed were not always poor, isolated, or associated in the public imagination with gang violence. They had been built over decades, and many black families arrived there with steady work, savings, and a strong belief that Los Angeles offered possibilities unavailable elsewhere. During the first half of the 20th century, large numbers of African Americans left the South. They were escaping racial violence, restrictive laws, political exclusion, and agricultural work that offered little chance of advancement. Some travelled north to Chicago, Detroit, and New York. Others continued west to California. Los Angeles advertised itself as a different kind of American city. It was newer, less crowded, and surrounded by industries that appeared to be expanding. During the Second World War, aircraft factories, shipyards, automobile plants, steel operations, rubber companies, and other manufacturers needed workers. Black migration to Southern California increased as families followed those jobs. The promise was real, but it was limited. A black worker might find employment in a factory while discovering that many neighbourhoods near that factory would not sell or rent to his family. Real estate boards, homeowners, lenders, and government programs helped maintain residential segregation. Restrictive covenants were written into property agreements to prevent homes from being occupied by black residents and other groups considered undesirable by white homeowners. Banks denied loans or offered unfavourable terms in areas marked as risky, with race often influencing how that risk was defined. Federal law eventually prohibited explicit housing discrimination, most importantly through the Fair Housing Act of 1968, but laws do not immediately erase property patterns created over generations. Families who had been prevented from buying homes in growing neighbourhoods missed the chance to build wealth, as those properties increased in value. Families concentrated in restricted areas faced overcrowding, limited housing supply, and landlords who could charge more because tenants had fewer choices. Imagine arriving in Los Angeles in the 1940s with a factory job and enough money for a down payment. You look at the palm trees, the low houses and the open sky, and you believe you have reached a place where your children will have more room than you did. Then an agent tells you that a house is no longer available. A bank refuses the mortgage. A white neighborhood association warns owners not to sell. Another family that managed to move beyond the accepted boundary finds threatening messages or damage to its property. You can work in the city. You can help build its aircraft, vehicles, and industrial wealth. But the city has already decided where it prefers you to live. The area that became known as South Central developed as a major centre of black life in Los Angeles. Central Avenue contained clubs, restaurants, hotels, stores, and businesses serving a community often excluded from white establishments. Churches provided spiritual life, political organisation, charity, and practical support. Black newspapers reported stories ignored by the larger press. Families bought houses where they could, sometimes paying more than white buyers would have paid for similar property elsewhere. This was not an empty district waiting for crime to arrive. It was a community created under pressure. There were serious problems, but there was also stability. Many adults worked in manufacturing, construction, transportation, public service, domestic labour, and small business. Children attended local schools. Neighbours knew one another. Home ownership created blocks where families remained for years and expected their children to do the same. Youth groups existed in this environment long before anyone had heard the names Crips or Bloods. Some were social clubs based around schools, neighbourhoods, cars, dances, or local hangouts. Young men gathered because young men have always gathered. They wanted friendship, recognition, excitement, and a sense that they belonged somewhere. Groups organised parties, attended sporting events, met at skating rinks, and developed names connected to particular streets or areas. They also fought. Neighbourhood pride could become neighbourhood rivalry. A disagreement at a dance could lead to another confrontation the following week. Groups travelled to parties together partly for companionship and partly because arriving alone could be dangerous. A young man attacked outside his neighbourhood might return with friends. Those friends might not know exactly what caused the first fight, but they understood that their group had been challenged. Black street groups in Los Angeles can be traced well before the 1960s. Researchers have described small groups operating in South Los Angeles during the 1930s and larger, more conflict-oriented groups developing after the Second World War, especially in and around Watts and its public housing projects. Racism, local conflict, and the concentrated conditions of project life all contributed to their development. The projects are important to this story because their design could intensify local identity. A large housing development contained hundreds or thousands of residents living within a clearly defined area. Children attended the same nearby schools, used the same courtyards, and knew the same entrances and paths. Outsiders were easy to recognise. A conflict involving one resident could quickly involve relatives and friends who lived only a building away. The project could provide community and security. It could also produce a powerful distinction between the people inside and the people beyond its boundaries. By the 1950s, several established black youth gangs operated in Watts and surrounding areas. Their fights could be serious, but their weapons were often fists, knives, clubs, chains, or improvised objects. Guns were present, and people were killed, but firearms had not yet become the routine element of street confrontation that they would become later. The scale was different. A beating could cause terrible injury. A knife could kill. But when a group of young men fought with fists, the number of people harmed was usually limited by physical distance. Participants had to approach one another. They could run away. Bystanders could sometimes intervene. The conflict might end when one side retreated. The increasing presence of guns would eventually remove many of those limits. Before that happened, Los Angeles passed through the upheavals of the 1960s. The civil rights movement created a new political language for black Americans across the country. In Los Angeles, organizations challenged employment discrimination, police abuse, poor housing, and unequal schools. Young people who might once have entered neighbourhood clubs could also be drawn toward political groups, community programs, cultural organisations, and movements demanding structural change. This did not end gang conflict, but it altered the environment in which youth groups operated. Some older gang members became involved in political work. Others encountered organisations that offered discipline and identity beyond a local street. Groups associated with black nationalism and community organising attempted to redirect young men toward larger goals. Then came August 1965. The Watts Uprising began after the arrest of a young black motorist, Marquette Fry, by the California Highway Patrol. A crowd formed. Tensions escalated. Over the following days, violence, fires, looting, police action, and National Guard deployment transformed parts of Watts and nearby neighbourhoods. 34 people died. Hundreds of buildings were damaged or destroyed. Thousands were arrested. The uprising shocked Los Angeles, but it did not come without warning. The McCone Commission, created to investigate the causes, identified unemployment, poor schools, inadequate housing, and deep hostility toward police. Residents had repeatedly described aggressive treatment by law enforcement. The events of 1965 exposed conditions that had been allowed to build beneath the city's optimistic image. For many white residents, Watts became proof that the area was dangerous. For many black residents, the uprising proved that the city had ignored them until flames made neglect impossible to overlook. Money and promises followed. Government programs expanded. Community organizations received support. Officials discussed jobs, education, and neighborhood improvement. Yet the response was uneven, temporary, and far smaller than the problems it was expected to solve. The physical damage could be measured. The damage to trust was harder to calculate. Police had long occupied a complicated place in Black Los Angeles. Residents wanted protection from burglary, assault, robbery, and violence. They also described being stopped, searched, insulted, or treated as suspicious in their own neighborhoods. The Los Angeles Police Department under Chief William Parker had developed a reputation for professionalism and centralized control, but also for distance from minority communities and a style of policing that could resemble occupation rather than service. The department often saw aggressive enforcement as necessary to control crime. Residents often saw the same enforcement as evidence that officers viewed the entire community as criminal. Both fears reinforced one another. Officers entered neighborhoods expecting hostility. Residents encountered officers expecting disrespect. Every confrontation became part of a larger history remembered by both sides. After 1965, the relationship did not heal. At the same time, the political organizations that had attracted some young people came under intense pressure. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's COINTELPRO operations targeted black political groups, including organizations considered radical or revolutionary. Local police also monitored, raided, arrested, and disrupted activists. Internal divisions, government pressure, criminal prosecutions, and violence weakened several organizations that had offered young residents political education, community programs, and a sense of collective purpose. It would be too simple to say that gangs appeared because political groups disappeared. The causes were more complicated, and street groups had existed long before the rise or decline of black political organizations. Still, the timing mattered. A teenager entering adolescence around 1970 encountered a different landscape from the one available only a few years earlier. Some neighborhood institutions had weakened. Political movements had lost leaders to prison, death, exile, conflict, or exhaustion. Public programs created after Watts were often reduced as funding priorities changed. The larger economy was beginning to move away from the industrial employment that had supported many local families. The neighborhood remained full of young people who needed identity, protection, and a place to belong. The organizations capable of giving them those things were not always the ones adults would have chosen. One of the young men growing up in this environment was Raymond Washington. Washington is generally identified as a founder of the group that became the Crips around 1969. Accounts of the exact beginning vary. This is common in gang history because the people involved did not produce official records, and later memories were shaped by reputation, rivalry, police interpretation, and legend. What is clear is that Washington and other young men developed a group in the area around Fremont High School and the east side of South Los Angeles. Another important figure, Stanley Tukey Williams, became associated with Crip expansion on the west side. The early Crips gained a reputation for physical aggression, intimidation, robbery, and assaults on other young people. The group's name and identity spread. Some neighborhood groups joined voluntarily, some copied the style, some adopted the name for protection or prestige, others resisted. This was not the formation of a conventional organization with a headquarters, membership records, and a clear chain of command. It was closer to the spread of a brand combined with a local alliance. A neighborhood group could become a Crip set while retaining its own leaders and territory. The shared identity could offer allies, but it did not eliminate local independence. As more groups adopted the name, the word Crip became both powerful and unstable. It could unite young men against outsiders while doing little to prevent conflict among those using the same label. The groups opposing Crip expansion faced a practical problem. A small independent gang might be able to defend its own block against another small group. It could not easily resist a rapidly growing network of Crip sets. Some non-Crip gangs therefore formed alliances for mutual protection. The Pyrrhus, Brims, and other groups became central to the development of the blood identity during the early 1970s. Official and scholarly summaries generally place the formation of the Crips around 1969 and describe the Blood Alliance as an effort by rival groups to resist Crip domination. At first, the numbers favoured the Crips. That imbalance affected how the blood identity developed. Belonging to a smaller alliance encouraged strong loyalty and a clear sense of opposition. The Crips were not simply another gang. They were the larger force against which several neighbourhoods defined themselves. The colours that later became famous were part of this identity, but clothing did not operate as a perfect uniform. Blue became associated with Crips and red with Bloods. Yet people did not always dress according to rules later presented in films and news reports. Styles changed. Local sets developed their own symbols, hand signs, names, and ways of writing. Graffiti became a public declaration of presence. A gang name painted on a wall told residents and rivals that a group claimed influence there. Crossing out another set's name was not ordinary vandalism. It could be read as a deliberate insult. Writing over it intensified the challenge. A wall became a message board in a conflict where reputation had practical value. Reputation could discourage attacks. It could also invite them. A set known as violent might believe that its reputation protected its members. Rivals might attack that set precisely because defeating a feared opponent produced greater status. Young members entering the group had to prove themselves within a history they did not create. This is where neighbourhood identity began turning into inherited conflict. Suppose two groups fought after a party in 1971. One young man was badly injured. His friends retaliated several days later. The second group answered. By 1974, teenagers joining both sides might know only that the other neighbourhood was an enemy. By 1978, some of the original participants might be dead, imprisoned, no longer active, or living elsewhere. The rivalry remained. Nobody needed to remember the first fight because the funerals that followed had created newer reasons for hatred. Every death widened the number of people with a personal connection to the conflict. A victim had brothers, cousins, friends, classmates, and neighbours. Some wanted revenge, others wanted no involvement, but still became identified with the victim's neighbourhood. Violence spread socially before it spread geographically. The outside world often described gang members as though they were people without families. In reality, they belonged to dense networks of relatives and friends. One household might contain an active gang member, a younger sibling trying to avoid the gang, a mother working 2 jobs, a cousin serving in the military, and a grandmother who had lived on the block for 30 years. The gang did not replace the neighbourhood, it passed through it. That distinction explains why eliminating gang influence was never as simple as removing a few individuals. Arresting a leader might weaken one group, but it could also divide the group into smaller factions. A respected older member might have restrained younger men from certain acts. When he was killed or imprisoned, several ambitious members could compete for status. Fragmentation made the landscape harder to understand. A person could know that a neighbourhood was broadly associated with the Crips, and still be unaware that 2 Crip sets within it were enemies. Shared colours did not guarantee peace. A local rivalry could matter more than the larger Crip blood division. Family connections could cross affiliations. Drug partnerships could temporarily cross them as well. The simple map shown to outsiders contained 2 colours. The real map contained dozens of histories. Economic changes made those histories more dangerous. During the post-war decades, factories had given many Los Angeles families access to wages that did not require a university degree. These jobs could be difficult, dirty and unstable, but they offered structure. A worker woke at a set time, travelled to a plant, received a paycheck, and often knew older relatives or neighbours employed in the same industry. As manufacturing declined or moved away, that path narrowed. The problem was not merely that young men lacked jobs. The disappearance of work weakened a chain connecting generations. A father who had entered a factory after high school could no longer confidently tell his son to follow him. A relative who once helped someone obtain an apprenticeship might have been laid off. Businesses serving industrial workers lost customers. Tax revenue and neighbourhood spending declined. The legal economy was not gone, but it became less accessible precisely when the youth population needed it most. A gang could not offer the stability of a union job. It could offer immediate recognition. For a teenager who felt invisible at school, watched his family struggle, and expected strangers to disrespect him, reputation could become a form of currency. The ability to frighten people created a temporary sense of control. A street name could feel more important than a name used by teachers who expected little from him. This did not make gang membership rational in every case. It made it understandable without making it harmless. By the middle and late 1970s, the number of Crip and Blood sets increased across South Los Angeles. Researchers describe the early 1970s as a period when groups using Crip names appeared throughout the area, followed by a smaller but growing number of Blood sets. The streets became more violent as the groups multiplied, and their behaviour became increasingly predatory. Police responded to the visible symptoms. Patrols increased. Officers developed lists of suspected members. Specialised knowledge of graffiti, clothing, nicknames and neighbourhood affiliations became important to investigations. A young man's associations could attract police attention, even when officers had no evidence that he had committed a particular crime. From the department's perspective, identification was necessary. Gang crimes were difficult to solve because witnesses feared retaliation, and rivalries stretched across multiple incidents. From the neighbourhood's perspective, identification could become indiscriminate. Teenagers who lived in a gang area, attended school with members, or dressed according to local fashion could be classified as gang-associated. Once that label attached to someone, ordinary behaviour looked suspicious. A group standing on a corner became a gang gathering. Running from police became proof of guilt. Remaining in place became defiance. Residents were left with an uncomfortable truth. The city had allowed conditions to deteriorate, then treated the people living within those conditions as the source of the entire problem. None of this removes personal responsibility from those who robbed, assaulted, or killed. Structural conditions did not pull triggers. Individuals made decisions and their victims paid for those decisions. But responsibility and explanation are not opposites. A complete history must hold both at the same time. Young men committed serious crimes. The city also created unequal neighbourhoods. Gang members terrorised residents. Police sometimes treated those same residents as enemies. Families made mistakes, institutions failed, people exercised choice, but they did not choose from equal circumstances. By the end of the 1970s, South Central contained the elements of a much larger disaster. Territorial identities had spread, rivalries had become inherited, economic opportunities had narrowed, police community trust remained weak. Firearms were becoming increasingly important in street conflict. The major crack cocaine markets had not yet transformed the neighbourhood economy. The flood of money associated with the 1980s was still ahead. The most infamous drive-by shootings had not yet become a routine feature of evening news reports. Even so, the battlefield had already been prepared. Its borders were school routes, parks, housing projects, alleys, and commercial streets. Its combatants often knew one another by nickname or reputation. Its civilians lived in the same houses, rode the same buses, and shopped in the same stores. The neighbourhood had not stopped being a neighbourhood. That was what made the coming years so destructive. When violence entered a battlefield, soldiers were endangered. When violence entered South Central Los Angeles, everyone was already home. The next change would come from the way the Crip and Blood identities expanded beyond their original groups. As each name spread, it created new alliances, new enemies, and new divisions within the alliances themselves. What appeared from a distance to be a war between two sides was becoming a much more difficult conflict, involving dozens of sets, hundreds of personal disputes, and young people inheriting loyalties before they fully understood what those loyalties required. By the time the map of South Central Los Angeles had been divided into dozens of local territories, the names Crips and Bloods had begun to mean something larger than the young men who first used them. They had become identities that could move from one neighbourhood to another, gathering new members, new enemies, and new meanings as they spread. The most widely accepted account places the beginning of the Crips around 1969 and connects their formation to Raymond Washington, a teenager from the east side of Los Angeles. Washington was known as physically strong, confident, and capable of attracting other young men around him. He had grown up in a part of the city where neighbourhood groups already existed, where school rivalries could become street rivalries, and where a young man's ability to defend himself affected how others treated him. Washington did not invent the idea of a neighbourhood gang. Los Angeles had contained black youth groups for decades. What changed was the speed with which the Crip identity expanded and the level of fear attached to it. The exact origin of the name remains disputed. Stories have connected it to earlier names such as the Baby Avenues, the Avenue Cribs, or a newspaper description of young men carrying canes and appearing crippled. Some versions were repeated so often that they became accepted as fact, even when the documentary record remained uncertain. Gang history was usually passed through memory, conversation, police reports, and stories told years after the events. The people involved did not keep official minutes of meetings or create a founding document. What can be established more confidently is that groups using the Crip name began appearing across South Los Angeles in the early 1970s. Researchers studying the period found that new Crip-affiliated groups spread through many neighbourhoods within only a few years. The Crips were therefore not one tightly controlled organisation expanding under a single command. They were an umbrella identity adopted by separate local groups, often called sets, which maintained their own leadership, territory and rivalries. Stanley "Tookie" Williams became another central figure in the early history. Williams was associated with the west side of South Central, while Washington's influence was strongest on the east side. Later accounts often describe the two men as co-founders, who united powerful groups under the Crip name. The reality was probably less formal. Their reputations helped the identity spread, but neither man exercised complete control over every group that adopted it. That lack of central control would shape everything that followed. A conventional organisation can issue orders, punish unauthorised actions, negotiate a lasting truce, and decide who may use its name. The early Crip network could do none of those things reliably. A local set might identify as Crip while ignoring older members in another neighbourhood. It might create its own rules, recruit independently, and begin disputes without consulting anyone beyond a few blocks. The shared identity provided recognition. It did not provide unity. At first, joining the Crips could offer immediate advantages to a small neighbourhood group. The name carried a reputation. A group that adopted it appeared connected to something larger and more feared. Its members could claim allies elsewhere in the city. Rivals might hesitate before attacking because they could not be certain which other sets would respond. The name also attracted young men who wanted status. A teenager did not need property, education, or employment to become known in the street. He needed a reputation, and people willing to repeat it. He could gain that reputation through fighting, robbery, intimidation, loyalty, or a willingness to take risks others avoided. The gang offered a system in which qualities ignored or punished elsewhere could become valuable. Schools were important recruiting grounds because they brought together young people from several neighbourhoods. A student could meet members from another area, learn new symbols, and carry those ideas back to his own block. Parties, skating rinks, parks, juvenile facilities, and bus routes also helped spread the identity. The expansion was not always voluntary. Some groups joined because they believed affiliation would protect them. Others joined after being attacked or pressured by Crip members. A smaller neighbourhood gang, facing a larger and more aggressive group, had limited choices. It could resist alone, seek allies, or accept the identity of the stronger side. The early Crips gained a reputation for attacking people who were not part of their own group. Robberies, assaults, and confrontations at social gatherings increased the fear surrounding the name. That fear helped the Crips grow, but it also created the conditions for organised resistance. Several established gangs refused to become Crips. Among them were groups associated with the Peru Street area in Compton and the Brims on the west side. Other independent groups also found themselves facing a larger number of Crip sets. During the early 1970s, some of these non-Crip gangs began cooperating for protection. This alliance gradually developed into what became known as the Bloods. Historical summaries generally describe the Bloods as a defensive alignment, formed by gangs resisting Crip expansion, with the Pyrrhus and Brims playing important roles. The Bloods did not emerge as a single gang any more than the Crips had. They were an alliance of separate groups that shared a common enemy. A member could identify strongly with his local set and, more broadly, with the Blood identity. The local name often mattered most because the people on the same block were the ones he knew personally, fought beside, and depended upon. The difference in numbers was significant. Crip sets were more numerous during the early period, which encouraged blood groups to emphasise loyalty and solidarity. A smaller alliance facing a larger rival could not afford to appear divided. Red became associated with blood identity, while blue became associated with the Crips. These colours later became famous through television, music and film, but their use was never as simple as outsiders imagined. Gang members did not spend every day wearing complete uniforms. Clothing styles changed, and police attention made obvious identification risky. Local groups used combinations of colours, sports clothing, hats, shoelaces, jewellery, and other signs that might be clear to people in the neighbourhood, but meaningless to someone unfamiliar with the area. The symbols were useful because they could communicate without a long conversation. A colour could announce affiliation, a hand sign could identify a set, a word written on a wall could claim territory, a crossed-out name could declare hostility. Graffiti served several purposes. It marked presence, honoured dead members, threatened rivals, and recorded alliances. It also made conflict visible to everyone living nearby. A resident walking past a wall could see that one set had entered another's territory. A name crossed out and rewritten several times might indicate that a dispute was active. To the young men involved, the wall carried information. To the family living behind it, the wall could attract gunfire. As the identities expanded, the distinction between Crips and Bloods appeared increasingly clear from a distance. Journalists, police officers and residents outside the affected neighbourhoods could understand the conflict as two opposing sides. Inside the neighbourhoods it was far more complicated. Crip sets fought other Crip sets. Blood sets sometimes fought other blood sets. A personal disagreement between members of allied groups could become a local war. Two sets might cooperate against one enemy and remain hostile over another issue. Family relationships crossed gang boundaries. A man could have cousins affiliated with the opposing side. A friendship formed in school could survive even when the neighbourhoods became enemies, or it could collapse under pressure from both groups. The umbrella names never erased local history. This is one reason the conflict expanded so quickly. There was no central authority capable of preventing a new rivalry. If one member of a set attacked someone from another neighbourhood, the second group did not wait for a formal explanation. It responded according to street expectations. Retaliation was not merely emotional, it was tied to reputation. A gang that failed to answer an attack risked appearing weak. Weakness could invite additional attacks, robberies, or challenges. Members therefore believed that retaliation protected the group, even when the retaliation guaranteed another response. The logic was circular but powerful. Violence was necessary because enemies were violent. Enemies were violent because violence had already occurred. Each side could describe itself as responding to the other. The original cause became less important with every new death. Suppose a young man was beaten at a party. His friends returned several nights later and attacked someone from the rival neighbourhood. That person's friends then shot at a car belonging to the first group. One passenger died. His funeral brought together relatives, classmates, and younger boys who admired him. Several of those younger boys joined the set afterward. They did not remember the party. They remembered the coffin. This process allowed a temporary dispute to become an inherited obligation. New members entered a conflict carrying grief that felt personal, even when the history was unclear. Older members told stories about previous attacks. Some stories were accurate, others were incomplete, exaggerated, or altered over time. The gang preserved memory selectively. Its own dead were remembered as loyal friends. The dead on the other side were described as enemies. The suffering of local families became part of the group's identity, while the suffering caused elsewhere was easier to ignore. Raymond Washington's influence declined as the Crips became larger and more fragmented. He was imprisoned during part of the 1970s, and the expanding network moved beyond the control of any founder. Washington was killed in 1979, shot in Los Angeles at the age of 25. His murder was never conclusively solved. Stanley Williams was arrested that same year, and later convicted of 4 murders committed during robberies. He remained in prison for decades, and became internationally known for anti-gang writing and activism before his execution by the state of California in 2005. The removal of the early figures did not weaken the identities they had helped create. By then, the names belonged to hundreds and eventually thousands of people who had never met either man. This is an important point, because public accounts often search for a leader who can be blamed, arrested, or persuaded to stop the violence. The Crips and Bloods did not operate like armies waiting for instructions from a general. Their structure was decentralized, and that made them difficult to control from inside as well as outside. An older member could negotiate peace with another set, but younger members might ignore him. A respected figure could discourage shooting, but he could not prevent every personal dispute. A truce between 2 neighbourhoods did not include every Crip or every Blood in Los Angeles. Police investigators increasingly learned to focus on the local set rather than the broad identity. Knowing that a suspect was a Crip did not explain his specific enemies. Officers needed to know the street, the housing development, the school, the clique, and the recent history of shootings. The same was true for residents. A mother might understand that her block was associated with one set, but still need to know which nearby Crip neighbourhood was currently hostile to it. A bus route safe in 1 month might become dangerous after a shooting. A park used by several groups could become temporarily inaccessible after graffiti appeared or rumours spread. Children learned these changes through conversation. Adults warned them not to walk a certain way. Older siblings explained which hats or jackets could be misunderstood. Friends passed along news of fights and shootings. The information was rarely complete, but knowing something was safer than knowing nothing. Initiation into a gang varied from one set to another. Some new members were beaten for a fixed period by existing members. Others proved themselves through fighting, theft, carrying weapons, or participation in an attack. Not everyone entered through a formal ceremony, and not every member held the same status. Reputation had to be maintained after joining. A young member was watched for signs of fear or disloyalty. Refusing to act during a confrontation could damage his standing. Running away might follow him for years. This pressure encouraged dangerous decisions made in seconds. The group could offer companionship and still demand behaviour that isolated the member from everyone outside it. Once identified as a gang member, a young man faced increased attention from rivals and police. Employment became harder if he developed a record. School discipline could remove him from ordinary classmates and place him among other troubled students. Juvenile detention connected him with members from different neighbourhoods, and sometimes strengthened his gang identity. Punishment did not always separate young people from gangs. Sometimes it introduced them to a larger gang world. Juvenile facilities and county jails became places where alliances were reinforced, rivalries continued, and local identities met people from across Los Angeles. A teenager who had known only his neighbourhood set could encounter older members and learn about conflicts elsewhere. He could return home with new contacts, new stories, and a stronger commitment to the identity. The prison system would later play an even larger role in organising racial and gang alliances, but the process was already visible. Outside the institutions, law enforcement was attempting to understand a situation that changed faster than official systems could record it. Police collected photographs, nicknames, addresses, tattoos, and graffiti. Officers created files on suspected members and attempted to connect shootings through patterns of retaliation. Specialised gang units developed knowledge that ordinary patrol officers often lacked. This intelligence could help solve crimes. It could also produce broad labelling. A person's name might enter a gang file because he had been stopped with known members, lived in a particular area, or appeared in a photograph. Once recorded, the label could influence future stops and arrests. A young man insisting that he was not a member might sound dishonest to an officer who had already seen his name in a file. Residents understood that association alone could be enough. A teenager could not always avoid gang members because they were relatives, neighbours, or classmates. Refusing all contact might be impossible, and could itself appear disrespectful. He learned to maintain enough familiarity to live safely while trying not to become involved. That middle position was difficult to explain to police. It was also difficult to explain to active gang members. By the end of the 1970s, the violence connected to Crip and Blood sets had grown more serious. The groups were increasingly associated with robbery, assault, burglary, and homicide. Yet their organisation remained inconsistent. Later law enforcement reports described the broad names as umbrellas covering many factions rather than single unified gangs. Even when some members became involved in larger criminal enterprises, local sets retained substantial independence. The average member was not a wealthy criminal organiser. Many were teenagers or young adults living with parents or relatives. Some attended school irregularly, some held temporary jobs, some committed frequent crimes. Others participated mainly in social activity, neighbourhood offence or occasional fighting. Membership existed on a spectrum, and people moved in and out of active involvement. This variation made public descriptions difficult. Calling every member a violent predator exaggerated the behaviour of many. Treating the gangs as harmless social clubs ignored the people they robbed, assaulted, and killed. Both images failed because the gangs contained different kinds of participants and changed over time. Women and girls were also present. Although early media coverage often treated the conflict as entirely male, some belonged to female sets connected to larger gangs. Others were relatives, partners, messengers, or active participants in crime and violence. Their involvement varied widely. Girls could face the same pressures to prove loyalty, while also experiencing exploitation and abuse from male members. Families responded in different ways. Some parents moved when they could. Some sent children to live with relatives. Some imposed strict rules and kept teenagers inside. Some confronted gang members directly. Churches organised youth programs, funerals, counselling and neighbourhood meetings. Coaches, teachers, former members and local activists tried to create alternatives. Their work rarely appeared in national reporting because prevention was less dramatic than a shooting. The success of those efforts depended on time, money and trust. A recreation program that operated for one summer could not replace a stable institution. A mentor could help several young people but could not repair an entire labour market. A church could comfort a grieving family but could not guarantee that the next retaliatory attack would not occur outside its doors. The gangs grew partly because they were present every day. They were on the street after programs ended. They knew the same people. They understood the local humiliations and fears. They offered immediate belonging without an application, fee or waiting period. The cost came later. A young man might join at 13 because older members treated him as important. At 15, he was expected to carry a gun. At 17, he had enemies he had never personally met. At 19, he might be imprisoned for an act committed during a few seconds of panic or anger. The gang gave him an identity before he had formed one independently. Leaving could mean abandoning the people who had become his closest friends. It could also expose him to rivals who did not care that he had changed. There was no official resignation process that erased old conflicts. The Crip and Blood identities were now strong enough to outlive individual participation. A former member could still be recognised. A neighbourhood could remain labelled long after its active group weakened. A younger brother could inherit the reputation of an older one. Territory did not require a permanent guard on every corner. The belief that an area belonged to a set could influence behaviour even when no members were visible. That belief would become more dangerous as firearms changed the way conflicts were carried out. During the early years, many gang confrontations still involved groups meeting face to face. Members fought at parties, schools, parks and street corners. Guns were used, but they had not yet replaced close physical confrontation as the expected form of retaliation. When firearms became more common, distance no longer reduced the danger. A rival did not need to enter the street on foot. He could remain inside a moving car. He did not need to identify the person responsible for an earlier attack. He could shoot at whoever appeared to belong to the neighbourhood. This widened the category of possible victims from individual enemies to anyone standing nearby. The Crips and Bloods had risen through local pressures, fear, imitation, protection, and reputation. They had spread because their names solved an immediate problem for young groups seeking allies or recognition. But every new set added another local history that the larger identity could not control. By the opening of the 1980s, Los Angeles did not face a simple conflict between two organizations. It faced a network of neighborhood wars connected by two famous names. Some wars involved Crips against Bloods. Some involved Crips against Crips. Some began over territory. Others began over personal insults, parties, girlfriends, robberies, or killings, whose original circumstances were already disputed. The city could count the sets, list their names, photograph their graffiti, and map the blocks associated with them. It could not easily measure the fear moving through families or the small decisions residents made each day to avoid becoming involved. Those decisions would soon become harder. The arrival of larger drug markets brought money into neighbourhoods where legal employment had been disappearing. More guns appeared. Cars made retaliation faster. The boundaries between sets became important not only for reputation, but also for control of profitable selling locations. Every street already had a history. Now some of those streets would acquire a market value. The invisible borders that had grown from school rivalries and neighbourhood loyalty were about to become lines. People defended with increasingly powerful weapons, while residents who had never agreed to any of those borders continued walking through them to reach work, school, shops, and home. The invisible borders did not appear on official maps of Los Angeles. A city map showed avenues, freeways, schools, parks, and housing developments. It did not tell a teenager that one side of a street was considered safe, while the other belonged to people who might treat him as an enemy. Residents learned that second map through experience. They learned it from older brothers who gave warnings before a walk to the store. They learned it from graffiti on walls, from the names shouted during fights, from rumours passed through schools, and from the sudden absence of friends who had been told to stay away from a certain block. Parents learned it after a shooting changed the route their children took home. Bus drivers, teachers, shopkeepers, postal workers, and police officers developed their own versions of the same map. The boundaries were rarely exact. A gang could claim a neighbourhood without controlling every person or every corner inside it. Members might gather around one street, park, apartment complex, or housing project. Their influence weakened as the distance increased. A rival group might claim an overlapping area. Some blocks were used by several sets at different times of day. Even gang members could disagree about where one territory ended and another began. That uncertainty made the borders more dangerous, not less. A person could cross one without realising it. He could believe he was still in a neutral area while someone watching from a porch believed otherwise. A hat, a sports jacket, a nickname, or the company he kept could change how he was interpreted. A city street is normally designed to connect places. In parts of South Central, the street could also separate identities. Consider a young person leaving school during the early 1980s. He may have no gang affiliation. He is carrying books and intends to go home. The safest route in terms of distance takes him through an area associated with another neighbourhood. He has walked there before without trouble, but a fight occurred over the weekend. Someone was injured, and rumours of retaliation have reached the school. He now has to make a decision. He can take the direct route and hope nobody notices him. He can walk several blocks out of the way. He can wait for friends. He can remove a jacket that might be misread. He can call home, although many families do not have anyone available to collect him. None of these choices guarantees safety. The danger did not come only from being an active member. Researchers examining Los Angeles gang violence between 1978 and 1982 found that gang incidents were more likely than other violent events to happen in public, involve cars and weapons, include multiple participants, and involve suspects who were not well known to victims. Fear of retaliation also made witnesses reluctant to cooperate. That pattern meant violence could reach people who had little understanding of the dispute. The person attacked might be mistaken for a member. He might be related to one. He might be standing beside one. He might simply be in a location associated with a rival set. Territorial violence depended on assumptions. Attackers often acted on what they believed a person represented rather than what they knew he had done. A common confrontation began with a question: "Where are you from?" In another setting, the words would have been ordinary. In this setting, they demanded an answer about affiliation and territory. The person asking might already have decided that the stranger did not belong. A response that sounded hesitant could be interpreted as fear. A confident answer could be taken as a challenge. Claiming no neighbourhood did not always resolve the situation, because neutrality had to be believed by the people demanding it. The question was sometimes called being checked. The purpose was identification, but it was also an assertion of control. The person asking was claiming the authority to decide who could move through the space. Refusing to answer challenged that authority. Giving the wrong answer could begin a fight or shooting. Young people adapted their behaviour around this possibility. They watched who was standing ahead. They crossed the street early rather than making the movement obvious at the last moment. They learned which bus stops attracted members of particular sets. They avoided staring too long at strangers because eye contact could be interpreted as disrespect. They avoided looking frightened because fear could attract attention. This required a constant awareness that adults outside the area often misunderstood. A teenager who appeared tense or guarded might not be planning violence. He might be trying to avoid it. Clothing became part of the calculation. Blue was broadly associated with Crips and red with Bloods, but the symbolic system was more complicated than two colours. Local sets used particular hats, letters, numbers, athletic logos, and combinations of clothing. Professional sports merchandise became useful because a team's initials or location could be given a neighbourhood meaning unrelated to the team itself. Someone could wear a cap because he liked the team. Someone else could read it as an affiliation. Schools sometimes tried to ban particular clothing, but the symbols changed. Removing one hat did not remove the local knowledge attached to colour, language, and association. Rules also affected students who had no involvement beyond following popular styles. The same problem appeared in police identification. Officers assigned to gang enforcement learned to recognise local signs. This knowledge could help them understand threats, identify suspects, and connect related crimes. It could also encourage officers to treat ambiguous evidence as proof. A young man photographed with gang members might be recorded as an associate. A person stopped repeatedly in one neighbourhood could become familiar to officers even if he had committed no serious offence. The border was therefore read by several authorities at once. Gang members read it as territory. Police read it as an area of suspected criminal activity. Residents read it as home. Those interpretations frequently collided. Graffiti was among the clearest ways gangs announced territorial claims. A set's name painted on a wall identified the group and demonstrated that its members felt able to mark the location. The writing might include the names of individual members, enemies, dead friends, or allied sets. Crossing out a rival's name was a direct insult. The act could lead to retaliation even if the person who painted over the name had not participated in an earlier conflict. The wall connected him to the group's accumulated history. Rival members might respond by crossing out his name, entering the neighbourhood to repaint the wall, or looking for someone associated with the set. Residents often wanted the graffiti removed because it attracted conflict and damaged property. Removal could create another difficulty. A freshly painted wall was a blank space inviting the gang to return and prove that it still controlled the area. A homeowner could repaint the same wall repeatedly and worry that someone would interpret the removal itself as disrespect. The territorial message was imposed on property owned by people who had no part in the rivalry. A family might wake to find a garage covered with gang names. The father painted it over. The names returned. He painted it again. At some point, the decision stopped being about appearance. It became a calculation about whether removing the writing made the house safer or drew more attention to it. Businesses faced similar choices. A store located near a disputed corner needed local customers, including relatives and friends of gang members. The owner might know active members by name because they had grown up nearby. Refusing them entry could create hostility. Allowing groups to gather outside could frighten other customers and attract police attention. Security measures changed the physical appearance of commercial streets. Bars appeared over windows. Cashiers worked behind thick glass. Doors remained locked and customers were admitted individually at night. Store owners installed brighter lights, cameras, and mirrors. These changes were rational responses to robbery and violence, but they also altered the relationship between businesses and residents. Every customer entered a space designed around suspicion. Public parks were especially difficult to control because they served several purposes at once. Children needed places to play. Teenagers gathered for sports and conversation. Families held picnics. Gang members also used parks as meeting places and visible centres of neighbourhood identity. A park could be peaceful during the morning and dangerous after school. A basketball game could involve players from several neighbourhoods without trouble for weeks. Then an argument changed the atmosphere. Friends joined both sides. The next game became a possible location for retaliation. Adults could not simply abandon every public space associated with a gang. These were often the only nearby recreation areas. Giving them up meant confining children to small homes and yards, if the family had a yard at all. Residents tried to reclaim parks through organised activities, church events, sports programmes, and neighbourhood patrols. Success often depended on whether funding continued and whether local people trusted the organisations involved. A programme that lasted several months might briefly change the use of a space, only to disappear when money ended. The gang did not need a grant to remain present. Housing developments created even stronger territorial identities. Large projects such as Jordan Downs, Nickerson Gardens, Imperial Courts, and others contained dense populations within recognisable boundaries. The layout of buildings, courtyards, entrances, and surrounding roads made it possible for local groups to watch movement into the area. For residents, the development was a community containing relatives, friends, and familiar routines. For police, it could become identified with a particular gang. For rivals, the entire project might be treated as enemy territory. That last interpretation endangered thousands of people who had no gang involvement. An attacker driving past a housing development could fire toward a group without knowing the individuals present. The location itself became the target. The drive-by shooting was well suited to territorial conflict, because Los Angeles was a city built around cars. Wide streets and nearby freeways allowed attackers to approach and leave quickly. A driver could remain inside the vehicle while a passenger fired. The movement reduced the attacker's exposure and made identification difficult. Witnesses saw a car briefly, often at night and under extreme stress. The method did not require accuracy. That was part of what made it terrifying. A person firing from a moving vehicle could miss the intended target and hit someone inside a house, on a sidewalk, or in a nearby car. The weapon's range extended the dispute beyond the people directly involved. By 1989, the LAPD reported 1,113 drive-by shooting incidents involving 1,675 victims. The department also estimated that as many as half of gang violence victims had no meaningful gang association. Police statistics reflected departmental definitions and should not be treated as perfect measurements. Whether an incident was classified as gang-related depended on the available evidence and the investigating officer's judgment. Still, the numbers show the scale of a form of violence that had become common enough to require specialised analysis. The sound of gunfire became information. Residents learned to distinguish firecrackers from shots. Some believed they could identify a handgun, shotgun, or automatic weapon by sound. They counted the shots and waited before approaching windows. Parents told children to lie on the floor or move toward the centre of the house. These reactions became routine through repetition. A child who dropped to the carpet after hearing shots was not necessarily panicking. He was following instructions. Houses were not designed as shelters from gunfire. Exterior walls, windows and doors offered limited protection. Families moved beds away from windows. Some placed heavy furniture against exposed walls. Children slept in interior rooms when possible. A front porch, normally a place of neighbourhood contact, became risky after dark. Sitting outside made a person visible to passing cars. Gathering with friends could be misinterpreted as a gang meeting. A parked vehicle slowing near the house could create immediate fear. The car might contain a neighbour searching for an address. Nobody knew until it passed. Territorial conflict also changed social relationships. Dating someone from another neighbourhood could be dangerous if either person had relatives or friends in a gang. A family gathering could bring together people whose affiliations made them enemies outside the home. Weddings, funerals, parties, and school events required attention to who had been invited and which disputes were active. Funerals were particularly vulnerable. They gathered a set's members in one location and made the time and place publicly known. Grief could intensify demands for revenge. Rivals might appear nearby whether to observe, provoke, or attack. Police sometimes monitored services because they expected retaliation. A funeral intended to end one person's story could become the beginning of another killing. Schools could not keep the border conflicts outside their gates. Students arrived carrying neighbourhood identities formed before enrolment. A school serving several areas might contain members of rival sets. Administrators adjusted schedules, increased security, monitored clothing, and separated students after incidents. A fight in a hallway could lead to violence off campus. A shooting outside school could empty classrooms the next morning because parents kept children home. Teachers attempted to continue ordinary lessons while students discussed who had been killed. The educational consequences accumulated quietly. Missing one day after a shooting seemed reasonable. Repeated absences became academic failure. A student who avoided school because rivals attended it might be labelled truant rather than endangered. Transfer to another school could place him in a different contested area. The boundary followed the student. Public transportation made avoidance even harder. Many families depended on buses. Routes crossed neighbourhoods without regard for gang territory. A passenger could board safely near home and leave the bus in an area where his clothing or address attracted attention. Bus stops created predictable gathering points. Students waited there at the same time each day. Rivals knew where to find them. Drivers and passengers witnessed threats, fights, and occasional shootings, but had limited ability to intervene. A family with a car had more control, but even driving carried risks. A wrong turn could place young men in another set's area. Music, clothing, passengers, or the appearance of the car could draw attention. Vehicles were essential to drive-by attacks, so residents also viewed unfamiliar cars with suspicion. Being lost was not always believed. Police attempted to respond by mapping gangs and assigning specialised units. By 1980, the LAPD estimated that street and motorcycle gangs included roughly 9,000 members and attributed nearly 4,000 serious crimes to them. The department assigned 133 officers full-time to a special gang program. These efforts reflected a real level of violence. Residents repeatedly demanded protection. Families wanted officers to arrest people carrying weapons and investigate shootings that had turned daily life into a series of precautions. The enforcement methods often created additional resentment. Officers stopped groups of young men, recorded names, searched vehicles, and questioned people about affiliations. The same territorial logic used by gangs could appear in policing. A person present in a known gang area was more likely to be treated as connected to the gang. Sweeps produced large numbers of stops and arrests, but not every arrest involved serious violence. People could be detained for warrants, drugs, probation violations, minor offences, or failure to follow police instructions. The operation appeared successful in official numbers, while residents judged it by what officers did at their doors and on their streets. A mother could support the arrest of armed gang members and still object when police forced her son against a wall. A shopkeeper could ask for more patrols and still resent officers treating every customer as a suspect. A resident could provide information about a murder and fear that police would fail to protect him afterward. Witness cooperation was limited not only by hostility toward police, but by the practical danger of being identified. Gang cases often involved unknown attackers, public settings, and strong fears of retaliation, making them especially difficult to investigate. The phrase, "no snitching," later became widely recognised, but reluctance to speak with police had several causes. Loyalty played a role. So did fear. Witnesses lived near suspects and could not leave after giving a statement. Court proceedings might reveal their identity. Police officers went home at the end of a shift. The witness remained on the block. Unsolved shootings strengthened the cycle. Each side developed its own explanation. Gang members believed police did not care enough to solve killings in black neighbourhoods. Police believed residents refused to help. Families saw both problems operating at once. Without arrests, retaliation appeared to be the only available form of justice to some members. That retaliation produced another investigation with frightened witnesses and little cooperation. Territory also shaped emergency medical response. Ambulances entered areas where shootings might still be active. Paramedics treated victims while police secured the scene. Hospitals received young men from rival gangs, and sometimes needed security because friends or enemies followed them. Emergency rooms recorded the physical consequences of the invisible map. A wound did not explain where the border had been crossed. It showed only what the border had done. The majority of residents continued living around these conditions without participating in the gangs. They formed neighbourhood organisations, attended meetings, reported abandoned buildings, organised sports, watched one another's children, and tried to interrupt conflicts before they escalated. Former gang members sometimes negotiated between sets because they understood the local history better than outside officials. Ministers contacted families after shootings. Mothers who had lost children spoke publicly against retaliation. Community workers entered places where police officers were not trusted. Their work prevented violence that never appeared in statistics. A shooting that did not occur produced no headline. A teenager persuaded to stay home that night remained unknown outside his family. A temporary truce might save lives even if it collapsed months later. The difficulty was that local peace operated inside larger conditions that remained unchanged. Jobs continued disappearing. Schools struggled. Housing remained segregated. Police relations remained damaged. More firearms entered the street. Drug markets were beginning to increase the financial value of particular locations. The invisible borders had originally been defended largely for identity, pride, protection, and reputation. The arrival of crack cocaine would add something more concrete. A corner could become a place where money was made every hour. An apartment could become a retail location. An alley could provide storage or escape. A street leading to a major road could help customers arrive and sellers disappear. Territory was about to become economically valuable in a new way. The same boundaries that already shaped school routes, friendships, and daily movement would be reinforced by a drug market capable of producing cash faster than most legal work available to local teenagers. The people living on those streets would still need to buy groceries, wait for buses, visit relatives, and send children to school. The map would remain invisible. Its consequences would become much harder to avoid. The invisible borders had already shaped movement through south-central Los Angeles before crack cocaine became widely available. Gang members defended streets for reputation, protection, local pride, and retaliation. Young people were attacked because of where they lived, whom they knew, or what others believed their clothing represented. Crack did not create those rivalries. It did not create residential segregation, unemployment, distrust of police, or the first Crip and Blood sets. It did not turn peaceful neighborhoods into violent ones overnight. Serious gang conflict had existed before the drug arrived, and many of the people who later sold crack were independent dealers rather than gang members. What crack changed was the speed at which money could move through the street, the number of people willing to compete for that money, and the value attached to locations that had once been defended mainly for identity. A corner was no longer only a place where members gathered. It could become a business location. An apartment was no longer only someone's home. It could become a place where cocaine was prepared, stored, or sold. A narrow alley could offer an escape route. A house near a busy road could receive customers without forcing them deep into the neighborhood. A stairwell in a housing development could provide shelter from police observation. A young person standing outside could act as a lookout and earn more in one afternoon than he could earn during several days of legal work. These arrangements did not appear fully developed at the beginning. The market expanded unevenly through experimentation, imitation, and opportunity. Powder cocaine had been available in Los Angeles throughout the 1970s. It was expensive and often associated with wealthier users, entertainers, nightlife, and professional social circles. People in poorer neighborhoods used and sold it as well, but its price limited the number of customers who could purchase it regularly. Freebase cocaine offered a more intense effect when smoked. but preparing it could involve dangerous and inconvenient methods. Crack simplified the sale of smokable cocaine into small hardened pieces that could be purchased individually. A person did not need enough money to buy a gram of powder. He could buy one rock. The low price of an individual dose opened the market to more customers. The effect was powerful and brief, encouraging some users to return repeatedly. A dealer could make many small sales in rapid succession, collecting cash throughout the day. Rock cocaine began appearing in South Central during the opening years of the 1980s. The exact moment is difficult to identify because the drug did not arrive through one supplier on one date. Police officers, dealers, users, journalists and researchers later gave different accounts. A Department of Justice investigation found evidence that forms of rock cocaine were present in Los Angeles before the market became widely visible, with law enforcement concern increasing around 1982 and 1983. Major newspaper coverage followed in 1984, by which time sales had already expanded sharply. Later stories often centred on a small number of famous dealers, especially Ricky Donnell Ross, usually known as Freeway Rick Ross. Ross built a large cocaine distribution operation during the mid-1980s and became one of the best-known figures associated with the South Central crack market. His rise provided a clear story for journalists. A young man with limited formal education entered the cocaine business, found reliable suppliers, lowered prices, developed a large customer network, and made enormous amounts of money. His organisation supplied dealers in Los Angeles and beyond. Yet no single dealer can explain the spread of crack. The Justice Department's Inspector General later concluded that Ross operated a major network, but was not solely, or even principally, responsible for the explosive growth of crack in Los Angeles. The market had already begun expanding before his organisation reached its peak, and many dealers were competing for customers by the middle of the decade. This distinction matters because the idea of one person flooding a neighbourhood can hide the conditions that allowed the market to grow. There was a large supply of cocaine, there were customers, there were experienced drug dealers. There were unemployed and underemployed young people looking for income. There were neighbourhoods where residents had little confidence that government institutions would protect or invest in them. There were existing street groups capable of organising people quickly, even if those groups were not centrally controlled. Crack connected these conditions without creating all of them. Early police and academic research also complicates the common belief that the Crips and Bloods immediately took control of the crack trade. A study of cocaine sale incidents in South Central found that arrests for cocaine sales rose by 375% between 1983 and 1985. Despite that dramatic increase, the researchers found that the early expansion was not dominated by identified gang members. Their later analysis concluded that regular drug dealers, rather than street gangs as unified organizations, controlled most of the initial Los Angeles crack market. That finding does not mean gang members were absent. Some participated as individuals. Some sets became deeply involved. Gang affiliation could provide workers, protection, contacts, and access to particular streets. As the market matured, more gang members recognized the profits available and entered sales. The point is that a gang set was not automatically a drug organization. Many sets lack the coordination required to operate a disciplined distribution network. Members might share a name while selling separately. One dealer could become wealthy while the young men standing with him remained poor. A set might tolerate several competing sellers in the same area. Personal disputes could interrupt business even when peace would have been more profitable. Researchers interviewing gang members in Los Angeles, San Diego, and Chicago during 1984 and 1985 found wide differences among groups. Some functioned mainly as social gangs. Others focused on parties, delinquency, or developing criminal businesses. Drug use was common across the groups, but their participation in dealing varied considerably. The public image of the gang as a corporation was therefore only partly accurate. A successful dealer might employ lookouts, street sellers, drivers, guards, and people responsible for preparing the product. He might purchase cocaine in quantity and distribute smaller amounts to sellers working beneath him. This could resemble a business hierarchy, but the hierarchy often belonged to the dealer rather than the entire set. Another member of the same gang might rob customers instead of selling to them. A third might avoid drugs altogether while participating in territorial violence. A fourth might sell for an independent supplier affiliated with a rival gang. The broad labels Crip and Blood did not produce a single economic system. Crack money still affected the larger gang environment because it changed what young people could see around them. A teenager living in a household where adults worked long hours for modest wages could watch a dealer purchase a car, jewellery, clothes and electronics with cash. The dealer appeared to have solved a problem that schools, employment offices and public programs had not solved for him. He had money. He had status. People noticed when he arrived. The image concealed the risks. Dealers were robbed, arrested, shot and betrayed. Profits were often spent quickly. Cars could be seized. Money could disappear into bail, lawyers, addiction and replacement drugs. A person making hundreds of dollars on one day might have nothing several weeks later. To someone observing from the sidewalk, however, the rewards were immediate and the consequences seemed distant. Legal employment offered the opposite arrangement. The rewards were modest and delayed. The rejection could be immediate. A young man might complete an application, wait for a call, travel beyond his neighbourhood, and be offered work paying little more than the minimum wage. A street dealer could hand him cash that afternoon for watching a police car and shouting a warning. Not every young person facing that choice entered the market. Most did not. Families, churches, schools, coaches, and individual determination kept many people away from it. But crack reduced the economic distance between a teenager and serious crime. He did not need to plan a bank robbery. He did not need specialised knowledge. He did not need to travel far. The market might be operating outside his building. Children were sometimes used as lookouts because police were less likely to treat them as major participants. A lookout could stand at the end of the block, ride a bicycle, or remain near an entrance. Different warnings indicated patrol cars, unfamiliar vehicles, or officers approaching on foot. At first, the task might appear minor. The child was not preparing cocaine or carrying a weapon. He was watching the street. The money made the activity feel ordinary. Once connected to the operation, he became useful for other tasks. He could carry small amounts because adults believed he would receive lighter punishment. He could take money to another location. He could introduce friends who wanted work. The market recruited by degrees. Someone began as a lookout. Then he held the product. Then he made sales. Then he carried a gun because sellers were being robbed. The gun changed his relationship with everyone around him. Drug markets produce conflict for reasons that do not require gang rivalry. Sellers cannot rely on courts to enforce agreements. They cannot call police when a supplier cheats them or when someone steals their inventory. Disputes over debt, quality, territory and missing money are settled through threats, exclusion, assault or killing. Reputation becomes a form of security. A dealer believed to be weak is easier to rob. A dealer known to retaliate becomes a more dangerous target. This resembles the logic that already governed gang conflict. An unanswered insult invited another insult. An unanswered shooting invited another attack. Crack placed valuable inventory and cash inside that same system. The result was not that every gang shooting became a drug shooting. Detailed examinations of Los Angeles homicides from the late 1980s found that the relationship among gangs, narcotics and murder was weaker than many public accounts suggested. Gang-motivated homicides were less likely than other killings to involve narcotics, while narcotics-motivated killings were less likely to involve gang members. The research did not support the claim that most gang homicides were simply battles over drug trafficking. The violence increased through overlapping causes. Drug markets created disputes. Drug profits helped purchase weapons. Gang rivalries created separate motives for shootings. Personal arguments became gang matters. Robberies targeted dealers because they carried cash. Users committed crimes to obtain money. Police intensified enforcement. Communities experienced all of these pressures at the same time. Crack changed everything without explaining everything. Firearms were central to that change. A street seller carrying cash and cocaine was an obvious robbery target. He wanted a weapon to protect himself. The person planning to rob him expected him to be armed and therefore carried a weapon as well. A lookout might carry one because rival sellers could approach. A gang member unaffiliated with the drug trade might obtain a gun because he believed drug money had allowed enemies to become better armed. The presence of one gun encouraged the presence of another. The weapons were not always new or technically advanced. Revolvers and ordinary semi-automatic pistols remained common. Shotguns and rifles appeared as well. What mattered was the growing expectation that a confrontation could involve gunfire. The term automatic weapon was often used loosely by witnesses, journalists, and frightened residents to describe rapid shooting. Some weapons were capable of firing automatically, but many attacks involved semi-automatic firearms that released one round with each pull of the trigger. To someone hearing repeated shots outside a window, the technical distinction offered little comfort. More powerful and higher capacity firearms increased the number of rounds that could be fired quickly. Cars allowed shooters to escape. The combination made retaliation easier to carry out and harder to direct accurately. An older gang fight might begin when two groups met at a party. A crack-era shooting could begin when a car entered a neighbourhood and fired at people standing outside. No conversation was required. No one needed to confirm that the intended target was present. The street itself could be treated as guilty. The increased danger changed the appearance of drug-selling locations. Some sellers worked openly on sidewalks, approaching cars or pedestrians. Others operated through houses or apartments. Buyers arrived at all hours, creating noise and traffic that affected everyone nearby. Residents recognized the signs. Cars stopped briefly. People approached windows. Strangers knocked on doors looking for the wrong address. Arguments occurred over money. Used pipes or small plastic bags appeared near homes and playgrounds. A house associated with sales could remain active through the night. For a family living next door, the drug market was not an abstract social crisis. It was a line of customers outside a child's bedroom. Reporting the activity carried risks. The dealer might know who had called. Police could raid the property and leave without making a lasting change. Another seller could replace the person arrested. Residents therefore made careful decisions about when to speak, whom to trust, and whether intervention would make the block more dangerous. Addiction affected households directly. Crack's short, intense effect encouraged repeated use. People spent money intended for rent, food, or utilities. Some disappeared for days. Parents and grandparents took responsibility for children whose mothers or fathers were using. Families sold property, borrowed money, or searched streets for relatives. The user was not always a stranger entering from outside the neighbourhood. It could be a sibling, a former co-worker, a parent, a person known for years before the drug changed his behaviour. The public language of the period often described crack users as morally ruined rather than medically and socially endangered. Terms such as crackhead became insults that reduced people to the most visible signs of addiction. Television reports showed thin bodies, damaged houses, and police raids. The person's earlier life usually disappeared from the account. The dealer received similar treatment. He became evidence of a criminal culture rather than a person operating within a larger market supplied through international networks and protected by demand extending far beyond one neighbourhood. Crack was sold on South Central streets, but the cocaine did not originate there. It passed through producers, traffickers, importers, wholesalers, transporters, money launderers, and suppliers before reaching a teenager holding several rocks in a plastic bag. Enforcement was most visible at the final stage because street sellers were easy to find. They stood outside. They had less protection. they could be arrested in large numbers. The higher levels of the market were more difficult to reach. This difference influenced how the drug war appeared to residents. Police could flood a neighbourhood, stop young men, enter homes and arrest street sellers while the supply continued. The operation created disruption without necessarily changing availability. A dealer was removed, another took the location, prices remained low, customers returned. The lack of visible progress encouraged more aggressive tactics. Los Angeles police began raiding suspected rock houses during the early 1980s as the market expanded. Enforcement units used informants, surveillance, undercover purchases, and search warrants. Officers encountered fortified doors, barred windows, weapons, and residents who warned dealers when police entered the area. The department increasingly described crack markets as an emergency requiring extraordinary action. Many residents agreed that the situation was an emergency. They did not necessarily agree that every police response was acceptable. Raids could damage homes and frighten children. Officers sometimes entered the wrong address or treated everyone present as a suspect. Large operations filled streets with police but did not guarantee long-term safety. People arrested for low-level possession, or sales entered a growing criminal justice system that removed them from the neighbourhood temporarily and returned many of them with fewer legal opportunities. An arrest record narrowed employment options. The narrowed options made illegal income more attractive. The cycle strengthened itself. Drug laws also became more punitive during the 1980s. Federal policy established severe penalties for crack offences compared with offences involving powder cocaine. Although both substances contained cocaine, the law treated relatively small amounts of crack as equivalent to much larger quantities of powder for sentencing purposes. The distinction had a disproportionate effect on black communities where street-level crack enforcement was concentrated. At the neighbourhood level, residents did not experience the policy as a mathematical ratio written in federal law. They experienced it through long sentences, absent family members, probation requirements, and men returning from prison after years away. The removal of dealers sometimes reduced immediate danger. It could also destabilise a set or market. An older dealer with established rules might be replaced by younger competitors who used more violence. Several people could fight over the abandoned location. The arrest solved one problem and created a struggle over who would inherit it. Drug income also changed leadership within some gangs. Physical strength and neighbourhood history had once been major sources of influence. Crack allowed a successful dealer to purchase influence. He could provide weapons, bail money, parties, cars, and financial help for friends or relatives. Younger members followed him because he had resources. This could weaken older members who opposed reckless violence but lacked money. It could also create conflict between gang loyalty and business interest. A dealer might prefer peace because shootings attracted police and drove away customers. A younger member might demand retaliation for an insult. Refusing could make the dealer appear disloyal. Agreeing could threaten the market that produced his income. Profit did not always make gangs more violent. Sometimes it gave influential people a reason to prevent violence near sales locations. Elsewhere, competition over the same customers produced shootings. The effect depended on local circumstances, personalities, and the organisation of each set. That variation was difficult to communicate in news reports. The outside world saw images of armed young black men, crack houses, grieving families, and police officers displaying seized weapons. The images were real, but repeated without context, they created the impression that every person in South Central belonged to the same criminal world. Employers became more suspicious of addresses from the area. Politicians discussed residents as a population to be controlled. Visitors avoided businesses, home values suffered, insurance became harder or more expensive to obtain. The neighbourhood paid for the market even when most residents had no involvement in it. Families who could leave sometimes moved to other parts of Los Angeles County, or to inland communities where housing was more affordable. gang identities travelled with some young people, spreading crip and blood sets beyond their original areas. Drug distribution networks also expanded outward, though claims of centrally directed national expansion were often exaggerated. A teenager moving with his family could attempt to leave the gang environment behind. He could also establish the identity in the new neighbourhood because it gave him status and protection in an unfamiliar place. The name spread through migration, prison contact, music, media attention, personal relationships, and imitation. By the second half of the 1980s, crack had become part of everyday public discussion in Los Angeles. Politicians promised stronger enforcement. Police demanded more resources. Journalists described an epidemic. Hospitals, treatment programs, schools, and child welfare agencies faced the effects of addiction. On the street, the market had become ordinary enough that children could describe how it operated. They knew which houses sold drugs. They knew which adults had changed. They knew why certain cars stopped. They knew when police were preparing a raid. Knowing did not mean they were involved. It meant the market had entered the environment in which they were growing up. The greatest change may have been the way several existing crises began reinforcing one another. Unemployment provided workers for the illegal market. Drug profits purchased guns. Guns made robberies, and retaliation more lethal. Shootings increased demands for policing. Aggressive policing damaged trust. Low trust reduced witness cooperation. Unsolved killings encouraged retaliation. Arrests created criminal records. Criminal records made legal employment harder. The drug market then appeared to offer one of the few remaining sources of immediate income. No single person designed this system. That made it harder to stop. By the end of the decade, residents were living with a level of violence that could not be explained by crack alone, but could not be understood without it. The drug had placed cash into the same streets where territorial rivalries were already active. It had increased the number of armed people protecting money, drugs, and reputation. It had brought police into homes and neighbourhoods with greater frequency and force. The young lookout at the end of the block was watching for more than a patrol car. He was watching for robbers. He was watching for rival dealers. He was watching for members of an enemy set. He was watching customers arrive with money. He was watching adults who might report the operation. Everyone else was watching him. The dealer wondered whether he could be trusted. The police officer recorded his face. The neighbour worried that gunfire would follow. His mother hoped he would come inside. South Central had become a place where many people believed they were defending themselves from someone else. Gang members defended territory. Dealers defended markets. Residents defended their families. Police defended their operations and one another. Each group carried a different understanding of the threat. Their actions met on the same streets. The crack market had not erased the old invisible borders. It had made some of them profitable, armed more of the people guarding them, and given the city a reason to enter those neighbourhoods with a level of force that would soon make ordinary families feel trapped between two wars. The young lookout at the end of the block was not the only person watching the street. A mother watched from behind a curtain because her son was late coming home. A shopkeeper watched the sidewalk through scratched protective glass. A police officer watched several young men standing beside a parked car and tried to decide whether they were preparing a crime or simply talking. The young men watched the patrol vehicle because experience had taught them that any encounter could become an arrest, a search, or an argument. Everyone believed danger might be approaching. They disagreed about who represented it. By the middle and late 1980s, many residents of South Central Los Angeles lived between two forms of authority. Gang members claimed control through reputation, threats, and violence. The Los Angeles Police Department claimed legal authority through patrols, stops, arrests, raids, and large enforcement operations. The two forces were not morally or legally equivalent. Gang members committed robberies, assaults, narcotics offences, and murders. Police officers were public employees with a duty to prevent those crimes and protect the people affected by them. the experience of residents was still more complicated than that distinction suggests. A person could fear the gang members outside his building, and fear what police officers might do when they arrived. He could want stronger law enforcement while believing the department treated his neighbourhood unfairly. He could report a shooting and refuse to answer other questions. He could support the arrest of a violent offender while objecting to hundreds of people being stopped because they lived in the same area. For many families, these positions were not inconsistent. They were survival. Imagine a woman living with 3 children in a small house near a street known for narcotics sales. Cars arrive at irregular hours. Some remain only long enough for a person to approach the window. Arguments occur outside. She has seen young men carrying guns and has heard shooting close enough to make the windows shake. She wants the police to remove the dealers. Then officers conduct a raid nearby. A helicopter circles overhead. Police vehicles block the street. Officers order people onto the ground, question residents, and enter a house. Several young men are arrested. Others are released after being searched. Her teenage son arrives during the operation. He has no drugs and no weapon, but he lives there, dresses like other boys his age, and knows some of the people being detained. An officer orders him against a wall. He protests. The officer interprets the protest as resistance. The mother now has 2 fears at the same time. She fears the drug dealers will believe her family called the police. She fears the police will treat her son as one of the dealers. This was the position occupied by many ordinary residents during the most violent years. They were not neutral because violence affected every part of their lives. They were not participants simply because they knew the people involved. They lived inside social networks where gang members, police targets, victims, witnesses, relatives, classmates, and neighbours were often the same people viewed from different directions. A gang member might also be someone's child. A police suspect might also be the person who carried groceries for an elderly neighbour. A murder victim might have committed violence in the past and still leave behind a grieving family. The categories used in official reports were clearer than the lives being described. Schools felt the pressure every morning. Students entered classrooms carrying news from the previous night. A shooting several blocks away might involve a former student, an older brother, or someone known by nickname. Teachers were expected to begin lessons while students whispered about who had been killed and whether another attack was expected. Some children arrived exhausted because helicopters, sirens, and gunfire had interrupted their sleep. Others stayed home because parents feared retaliation near the school. A student could miss class after a funeral, then miss another day because the funeral itself had increased tension between neighbourhoods. Administrators tried to control clothing, graffiti, fights, and gatherings. Security officers watched entrances. Teachers separated students associated with rival groups. Schools adjusted dismissal procedures so large groups would not leave at the same time. These measures could reduce immediate conflict without addressing what waited outside. A student could follow every rule inside the building and still face enemies at the bus stop. A transfer to another school could expose him to a different gang territory. Suspension removed a disruptive student from campus, but returned him to the street during school hours. The institution responsible for keeping him away from danger sometimes placed him directly in it. Teachers and counsellors attempted to intervene, often with limited resources. A staff member might identify a student at risk and spend weeks building trust, only to lose contact when the student was arrested, moved, expelled, or killed. Programs opened with public attention and closed when funding ended. The adults doing this work rarely knew whether a success would last. A student might stop carrying a weapon for several months. A family might move him to a relative's home. A coach might keep him involved in sports through one dangerous summer. None of these outcomes made national news, but they mattered to the people involved. Hospitals saw what happened when those efforts failed. Emergency rooms in and around South Los Angeles treated victims of shootings, stabbings, assaults, overdoses, and accidents connected to police pursuits. Medical workers cut away clothing, searched for entrance and exit wounds, replaced blood, and attempted to contact families. The age of the patients was difficult to ignore. Many were teenagers or young adults. Some arrived conscious and refused to identify the person who shot them. Others were unable to speak. Friends gathered outside, angry and frightened. Police officers entered to collect evidence or question witnesses. Hospital security watched for the possibility that rivals would follow. A shooting did not always end when the ambulance left. The hospital could become another location in the conflict. Friends wanted revenge. Relatives wanted answers. Police wanted cooperation. Doctors wanted enough space to keep the victim alive. A mother arriving at the emergency department might first encounter an officer asking questions before anyone told her whether her child would survive. The medical staff saw injuries that public language reduced to gang-related incidents. That label could be useful for classification, but it said little about the person on the table. It did not show whether he had joined a gang, lived in a gang neighbourhood, stood beside an intended target, or was struck by a bullet fired through a wall. By 1989, the LAPD reported more than 1,000 drive-by shooting incidents in a single year, and estimated that many victims had no meaningful gang connection. Those figures were based on police classifications and cannot capture every circumstance, but they support what residents had already learned. Territorial violence did not remain confined to active members. Churches became places where the consequences gathered. Ministers conducted funerals for young people they had baptized as children. Congregations raised money for burial expenses. Women organized meals for grieving families. Pastors attempted to prevent retaliation by speaking with friends of the dead before anger hardened into a plan. A funeral could contain several kinds of grief. There was grief for the person who had died. There was fear for the people attending. There was anger toward the rival neighborhood. There was frustration with police if the killing remained unsolved. There was shame among relatives who believed others were judging the family because the death had been labelled gang-related. Ministers often tried to describe the victim as more than the circumstances of his death. He had been a son, brother, father, student, friend, or troubled young man who had made dangerous choices. The gang label could not contain all of that, but the public discussion usually preferred simple categories. A dead gang member was presented as responsible for his own fate. An innocent victim was treated as a tragedy. Families knew that the line between those descriptions was not always clean. Someone could have participated in gang life and still be killed while trying to leave it. Someone could have committed crimes and still be loved. Someone officially described as an associate might never have joined at all. Community organisations tried to work in that complicated space. Former gang members entered neighbourhoods to mediate disputes because they understood the names, histories and personalities involved. Mothers who had lost children spoke to teenagers and demanded that they consider what retaliation would do to another family. Coaches kept recreation centres open late. Local activists organised marches, meetings and peace efforts. The work required credibility. A government official could announce a programme, but young people did not automatically trust it. An intervention worker needed to know which set controlled the area, who had recently been killed, and whether a proposed meeting would place enemies in the same room. He needed to speak with people who might be wanted by police without appearing to work for the police. One careless promise could destroy trust. The police faced a different pressure. Gang murders were difficult to solve. Witnesses feared retaliation. Attackers often fired from cars. Victims sometimes refused to cooperate. Several people could participate while giving conflicting accounts. A homicide detective might know which set was responsible, without having evidence sufficient for an arrest. Officers saw families demanding action, and streets where armed suspects appeared to move openly. Many concluded that ordinary patrol methods were not enough. The LAPD expanded specialised gang enforcement and adopted large suppression operations intended to overwhelm areas associated with violence and narcotics. The best known of these efforts became Operation Hammer. The name communicated the strategy clearly. The department did not intend to enter quietly, make a small number of arrests, and leave. Large numbers of officers would move into targeted neighbourhoods, stop suspected gang members, search for weapons and drugs, serve warrants, check probation and parole conditions, impound vehicles, and arrest people for offences ranging from serious felonies to outstanding warrants and minor violations. Police Chief Darrell Gates described gang crime in the language of war. The department believed visible force would disrupt street activity, reassure frightened residents, remove wanted offenders, and demonstrate that gangs did not control public space. One large hammer operation in June 1988 involved approximately 1,000 officers and produced more than 1,500 arrests over a weekend, according to contemporary police figures. The operation was concentrated in South Central but extended into other parts of Los Angeles. Police reported seizing drugs, weapons, cash, and vehicles. The number sounded impressive. It also raised an obvious question. How many of the people arrested were responsible for the serious violence that justified the operation? Large sweeps counted arrests, not solved social problems. Some detainees were suspected gang members wanted for serious crimes. Others were arrested for narcotics, weapons, warrants, traffic matters, or lesser offences. Many people stopped during such operations were not arrested at all. The department could point to weapons removed from the street. Residents could point to hundreds of young men ordered onto sidewalks, searched, photographed, and questioned. Both things could happen during the same operation. For families living in areas terrorised by shootings, the arrival of hundreds of officers could feel like relief at first. Dealers disappeared from corners. Cars stopped circling. Groups that normally gathered outside moved away. Parents allowed children to walk to a store with less fear. The relief might last one night. When police left, the conditions remained. A person arrested for a minor offence returned. A dealer replaced someone taken into custody. A gang member moved his activity several blocks away. The operation created a temporary absence of visible disorder without necessarily resolving the disputes, addiction, unemployment, or demand for drugs that produced it. The methods also damaged property and dignity. Officers entered homes, sometimes using force designed for situations involving armed resistance. Residents described belongings overturned, doors broken, and family members detained while searches occurred. Young men were photographed and questioned about affiliations. People who resisted verbally could be arrested for interfering with officers or failing to obey instructions. Police regarded compliance as essential during dangerous operations. Residents regarded some commands as deliberate humiliation. The same action could be interpreted very differently depending on who held authority. An officer ordering several men to lie on the pavement might believe he was controlling a potentially armed group. The men might believe they were being displayed to the neighbourhood as criminals without evidence. Children watched these encounters. They learned that gang members could carry authority through fear. They also learned that police officers could enter with overwhelming force. Neither lesson encouraged trust in ordinary civic institutions. Chief Gates and supporters of aggressive enforcement argued that the department was responding to violence. Residents had begged it to stop. That argument had truth in it. People in South Central repeatedly demanded safer streets. They called police after shootings, attended public meetings, and criticised officials for failing to protect them. The mistake was assuming that requesting protection meant accepting every method used in its name. Residents wanted murderers arrested. They did not necessarily want every black teenager treated as a murderer. They wanted drug houses closed. They did not necessarily want families in nearby homes subjected to indiscriminate searches. They wanted officers to respond quickly. They also wanted those officers to distinguish between the people committing crimes and the people trying to survive around them. The department's culture made that distinction difficult. The LAPD had long valued command discipline, aggressive crime control, and officer independence. Many officers saw themselves as a thin line separating the city from disorder. Working in areas with frequent shootings reinforced the belief that hesitation could be fatal. Officers encountered armed suspects. They attended scenes where children had been shot. They chased people who discarded guns. They saw witnesses refuse to identify attackers. Everyone in the neighbourhood appeared to know. Frustration hardened into suspicion. Suspicion could become contempt. The danger faced by officers was real. It did not justify every response to it. The Independent Commission on the Los Angeles Police Department, established after the Rodney King beating, later examined departmental records from the late 1980s and early 1990s. It found evidence that a significant group of officers repeatedly misused force or ignored department policy, while investigations and discipline were often inadequate. The Commission also examined racism, bias, training, complaints, and a police culture that tolerated problem officers for too long. Those findings did not mean every LAPD officer abused residents. Many performed difficult work professionally. Some built relationships in the neighbourhoods they patrolled. Others risked their lives responding to shootings, domestic violence, robberies, and calls involving armed suspects. The problem was institutional. A department can contain honourable officers and still fail to control abusive ones. Residents do not experience the average officer. They experience the officer standing in front of them. One abusive encounter could outweigh years of official statements about community service. A father thrown against a police car did not care that another officer elsewhere had behaved correctly. A mother whose complaint disappeared into the system did not measure the department by its written policy. Gang violence and police misconduct damaged trust in different ways. Gang members used fear openly. Their authority depended on the belief that disrespect would be punished. Police authority was supposed to depend on law. When officers appeared to act from anger, prejudice, or revenge, the betrayal felt different because residents had been told the department existed to protect them. That betrayal affected criminal investigations. A witness deciding whether to cooperate did not think only about the suspect. He considered whether police would protect his identity, whether detectives would treat him respectfully, whether officers would continue visiting his home in ways that exposed him, and whether the case would actually result in conviction. Silence could be interpreted as loyalty to gangs. Often it was fear combined with low confidence in the system. The police then treated silence as proof that the entire neighbourhood supported criminals. Residents saw that accusation as another reason not to trust police. The cycle continued. Women carried much of the burden created by both forms of violence. Mothers visited sons in hospitals, juvenile halls, county jails and prisons, and grandmothers raised children whose parents were addicted, incarcerated or dead. Women organised vigils and neighbourhood groups while maintaining households with limited income. They also negotiated directly with gang members. A mother might tell young men not to sell drugs in front of a house because children lived there. Her ability to make that demand depended on personal relationships and the respect she had earned over years. Police could not easily reproduce that influence. Some women allowed gang members to remain near the property because confronting them seemed more dangerous than tolerating them. Others called police despite the risk. There was no consistently safe choice. Shopkeepers faced the same problem. A business could be robbed by gang members and damaged during a police operation. Owners installed barriers and cameras, refused entry to groups, or closed early. Each measure reduced income in a neighbourhood already losing commercial services. When businesses closed, residents travelled farther for groceries, medicine and banking. Vacant storefronts then provided more places for illegal activity. A problem that began with violence became an economic problem, which then made violence harder to reduce. Public housing residents received particular attention from both gangs and police. A development associated with one set could be treated as a fortified territory. Officers entered expecting resistance. Rivals attacked the location as though every person inside represented the gang. Families could not separate their address from its reputation. A child filling out a job application might know that the employer recognised the development's name. A police officer stopping a car might react differently after seeing the address on the driver's licence. A resident inviting relatives to visit had to explain where to park and which entrance to use. Home had become evidence. Aggressive operations did produce arrests and seizures, but suppression alone could not create the conditions residents needed. Removing armed offenders mattered. It did not replace schools, treatment, employment, stable housing, witness protection, or trusted police relationships. Even the Justice Department's later description of effective gang enforcement emphasized a mixture of prevention, intervention, and suppression rather than enforcement alone. The LAPD itself eventually adopted similar language in its official gang strategy, acknowledging that lasting reductions required more than arrests. During the late 1980s, however, suppression was the most visible part of the city's response. Helicopters were visible, patrol cars were visible, young men lying on sidewalks were visible. The slow work of building trust was harder to see and easier to postpone. The result was a community that often felt occupied when police arrived and abandoned when police left. A resident called after hearing gunfire and waited for officers. When they came, she worried about how they would treat her family. When they departed, she worried that the shooters would return. This was what it meant to live between two wars. One war was fought among sets, dealers, robbers and individuals trapped in cycles of retaliation. The other was the war declared by the state against gangs and drugs. Ordinary people were described as the reason both wars had to be fought, but they had little control over how either side conducted itself. They paid for gang violence through funerals, medical bills, fear, and lost opportunities. They paid for enforcement through damaged trust, arrests, searches, and the constant possibility that someone they loved would be mistaken for someone else. By the opening of the 1990s, the pressure had spread far beyond the blocks, where gangs sold drugs or claimed territory. It was present in schools, courtrooms, hospitals, police stations, and city politics. The homicide rate continued to climb. Complaints against officers accumulated. Public officials promised order while residents asked what kind of order they intended to create. Then a man named Rodney King drove along a Los Angeles freeway in March 1991. The pursuit that followed ended on a dark street in the San Fernando Valley. Several officers struck and kicked him, while other officers watched. A nearby resident recorded the incident on a video camera. For the first time, millions of people outside South Central saw an image that many black residents believed confirmed what they had been describing for years. The beating did not create their distrust. The camera made that distrust harder for the rest of the country to dismiss. What followed would bring gang truces, courtroom decisions, political anger, and decades of accumulated grievance into the same tense months, moving Los Angeles toward the spring of 1992. The video recorded by George Holliday lasted only a few minutes, but it carried decades of distrust into living rooms across the United States. Shortly after midnight on March 3rd, 1991, California Highway Patrol officers attempted to stop Rodney King for speeding. King continued driving, leading officers on a pursuit through the San Fernando Valley. When the chase ended, Los Angeles police officers joined the arrest. Holliday stood on the balcony of a nearby apartment and pointed his home video camera toward the street. The recording showed King on the ground while officers struck him repeatedly with batons and kicked him. Sergeant Stacy Coon supervised at the scene. Officers Lawrence Powell, Timothy Wind, and Theodore Brasino were among those later charged. Other officers stood nearby. The video did not record every moment before or during the arrest, and the defense would later argue that individual sections needed to be examined separately. What viewers saw, however, appeared direct and difficult to misunderstand. A black man was lying on the pavement while uniformed officers delivered repeated blows. Television stations broadcast the footage again and again. For many Americans, it was shocking evidence that police brutality could occur in full view of other officers. For many black residents of Los Angeles, the shocking part was not the conduct itself. The shocking part was that someone had recorded it. Complaints about police violence had circulated in South Central, Watts, and other black and Latino communities for years. Residents described officers using unnecessary force, insulting people during stops, damaging homes during searches, and treating young men as gang suspects based largely on their appearance and address. Those complaints were often difficult to prove. A civilian's account stood against an officer's report. Witnesses might be relatives or friends of the accused. Injuries could be explained as the result of resistance. Internal investigations frequently ended without discipline. The King recording changed that balance. The public did not have to decide which written account sounded more believable. People could watch the blows. The Los Angeles County District Attorney charged 4 officers. The case became an immediate test of whether the justice system would punish police violence when the central event had been captured on video. The beating also led to a broader investigation of the Los Angeles Police Department. Mayor Tom Bradley created the Independent Commission on the Los Angeles Police Department, chaired by Attorney Warren Christopher. The Christopher Commission reviewed personnel files, disciplinary records, civil lawsuits, and communications among officers. Its conclusions went beyond the individual officers involved in the King arrest. The Commission found that a significant number of LAPD officers repeatedly used excessive force or ignored department rules, and that the system responsible for identifying and disciplining those officers was inadequate. It also examined racial bias, complaint procedures, supervision, recruitment, and the culture surrounding aggressive policing. This mattered because the city's argument could no longer be limited to a few officers making one bad decision. The Commission described an institutional problem. Chief Darrell Gates had already become a controversial figure. Supporters viewed him as a strong leader who defended officers working in dangerous conditions. Critics saw him as the head of a department that used military language and tactics against minority neighborhoods while resisting outside oversight. The King video intensified pressure for Gates to resign. He resisted. The conflict between the police chief, the mayor, the police commission, and community leaders became another public sign that Los Angeles did not agree on what the department's problem was, or who had the authority to fix it. While the city debated police reform, South Central continued living with gang shootings, narcotics markets, unemployment, and aggressive enforcement. The video had exposed one kind of violence, but it had not stopped the others. In the same month as the King beating, another death deepened anger across the city. On March 16, 1991, 15-year-old Latasha Harlins entered Empire Liquor Market in South Central Los Angeles. The store was owned by a Korean-American family, and Sunja-do was working behind the counter. Do believed Harlins was trying to steal a bottle of orange juice. A confrontation followed. Security camera footage showed Harlins placing the bottle in her backpack while holding money in her hand. Do grabbed at her. Harlins struck Do. As Harlins turned to leave, Do fired a handgun and shot her in the back of the head. Harlins died inside the store. The killing entered an already tense relationship between some black residents and Korean-American shopkeepers. Korean immigrants had opened businesses in neighborhoods where larger chains often did not invest. Many worked long hours and operated behind protective glass because they feared robbery and violence. Black customers sometimes believed they were followed, watched, or treated as potential thieves. Language barriers made ordinary disagreements harder to resolve. Shopkeepers saw themselves as vulnerable business owners. Residents sometimes saw them as outsiders, earning money in a community they did not respect. Neither group held the same economic power as the banks, property owners, government agencies, and corporations that had shaped the neighborhood. Yet daily conflict brought them into direct contact with one another. The Harlins case gave that conflict a human face. A jury convicted Do of voluntary manslaughter. Judge Joyce Carlin sentenced her to probation, community service, a fine and payment of funeral expenses rather than imprisonment. To many black residents, the sentence communicated that the life of a 15-year-old girl had little value. They compared the treatment of Do with the severe sentences imposed on black defendants for drug and property offences. The legal details of the cases differed, but the public conclusion was emotional and immediate. A young black girl had been shot in the back. The person who killed her would not go to prison. The National Archives later described the Harlins' killing and sentence as an important source of anger that combined with the Rodney King case and longer histories of police mistreatment, housing discrimination, and economic decline. Los Angeles was now waiting for the officers' trial. The defense requested a change of venue, arguing that intense publicity made a fair trial impossible in Los Angeles County. The case was moved to Simi Valley in Ventura County, a suburban area northwest of the city. The location became controversial because of its racial composition and its connection to law enforcement. Many police officers and their families lived in communities outside Los Angeles, including parts of Ventura County. The jury selected for the trial contained no black jurors. The absence did not automatically determine the verdict, but it affected public confidence before testimony began. Residents who already believed the justice system excluded them saw the trial moved away from the city where the beating occurred and placed before a jury that did not resemble the community most affected by LAPD force. The defense slowed the famous video down and divided it into separate frames and sequences. Attorneys argued that the officers were responding to King's movements and using force according to their training. Actions that appeared continuous when shown at normal speed were analysed as individual decisions made in fractions of a second. The prosecution argued that the force was excessive and continued after King no longer represented a serious threat. Millions of people had seen the tape, but jurors were instructed to decide the case from evidence presented in court rather than from public reaction. That distinction was legally necessary. It did little to reduce the tension outside the courtroom. People in Los Angeles did not view the trial as a narrow judgment of four officers. It had become a judgment of whether video evidence could overcome the protection surrounding police authority. If these officers were not convicted, many residents asked, what kind of evidence would ever be enough? The city knew the verdict could produce anger. It did not prepare adequately for the scale of that anger. Later investigations found that the LAPD and city government lacked effective emergency planning for civil disorder and were specifically unprepared for the possibility of unrest following the Simi Valley verdict. Command decisions were confused, resources were not positioned effectively, and the department struggled to respond as events spread. The failure was especially serious because Los Angeles had a historical experience with urban unrest. The Watts Uprising of 1965 had demonstrated how a police encounter could ignite anger, created by unemployment, discrimination, poor housing, and hostility toward law enforcement. Officials had studied the causes and issued recommendations. 27 years later, many of the underlying complaints remained. Housing discrimination had become less explicit but continued through economic patterns and accumulated inequality. Manufacturing employment had declined. Schools struggled. Gang violence had intensified. Drug enforcement had filled prisons while crack remained available. Police community trust had weakened. The city had changed demographically as Latino and Asian populations grew, creating new communities and new tensions within neighborhoods competing for limited opportunity. The unrest that followed would not be a simple repetition of Watts. Los Angeles in 1992 was larger, more diverse, more economically divided, and more heavily armed. Something unexpected was also occurring within the gang landscape. Members of rival Blood and Crip sets in Watts had begun discussing peace. The idea did not come from police headquarters or City Hall. It developed among people who had lived through years of funerals, shootings, and retaliation. Community organizers, former gang members, religious figures, and residents helped bring rivals into contact. Four major groups associated with Watts housing developments became central to the effort: the Bounty Hunter Bloods of Nickerson Gardens, the Grape Street Watts Crips of Jordan Downs, the Hacienda Village Bloods, and the P.J. Watts Crips associated with Imperial Courts. These groups had long histories of conflict. Their territories were close enough that ordinary movement could become dangerous. Residents crossing between developments risked being identified with whichever gang was associated with their home. The peace negotiations required participants to confront a problem that had defeated many earlier efforts. Every side had dead friends. Every side believed it had legitimate reasons for retaliation. No group wanted to appear weak. A truce could not work if one side treated it as an opportunity to attack the other. The participants had to create enough trust for enemies to occupy the same space without weapons settling the argument. The resulting Watts peace agreement took effect only days before the King verdict. Accounts of the precise signing date vary, but the agreement was in place by late April 1992 and involved the four major Watts factions. It sought to end attacks among the participating sets and redirect attention toward economic opportunity, community control, and opposition to police abuse. The truce did not include every Crip and Blood set in Los Angeles. It did not end the city's gang conflicts. It did prove that young men described publicly as incapable of organization could negotiate across years of violence when they believed the alternative was continued death. The timing was extraordinary, as some of the city's most feared street groups were attempting to stop fighting one another. The legal system was approaching a decision that would produce one of the largest outbreaks of civil unrest in modern American history. On April 29, 1992, the jury returned its verdicts. The officers were acquitted on most charges. The jury failed to reach a verdict on one count against Lawrence Powell. In legal terms, the decision concerned whether prosecutors had proved specific criminal charges beyond a reasonable doubt. In much of Los Angeles, that careful distinction disappeared immediately. People heard that officers had been videotaped beating Rodney King and had been found not guilty. The verdict reached radios, televisions, workplaces, schools, stores, and street corners during the afternoon. Anger gathered first in conversation. People called relatives. Employees stopped working to listen to reports. Students discussed the verdict in classrooms. Drivers heard it while moving through the city. Some people joined peaceful protests. Others moved toward intersections where crowds were forming. At Florence and Normandy Avenues in South Central, people gathered near a location already associated with narcotics activity, gang presence, and strained relations with police. Officers entered the area and made arrests during the early stages, but police units were later withdrawn as commanders attempted to regroup. The decision left a major intersection without effective control, while the crowd became more violent. Objects were thrown at vehicles, drivers were pulled from cars, businesses were attacked. Television helicopters broadcast the events live. One of the most widely remembered assaults involved truck driver Reginald Denny, who was pulled from his vehicle and beaten at the intersection. Several black residents, including Bobby Green Jr., Leigh Uile, Titus Murphy, and Terry Barnett, came to his aid and helped carry him away. The rescue rarely fit the simplest versions of the uprising. Black attackers had beaten Denny. Black strangers helped save him. The same crowd could contain people committing violence, people watching, people trying to stop it, and people searching for relatives. Television favoured images that could be understood quickly. The reality on the streets changed from person to person and block to block. Fires began. Looting spread. Police response remained disorganised. Some officers established defensive positions rather than entering areas where calls for help were multiplying. Firefighters faced attacks and could not safely reach every burning building. Residents protected homes and businesses themselves. Korean-American shopkeepers, believing police protection would not arrive, armed themselves and took positions on rooftops and inside stores. Images of armed Korean merchants became another enduring symbol of the unrest. For many Korean Americans, the weapons represented self-defense in a city that had abandoned them. For many black residents, the images appeared within the context of the Latasha Harlins killing and years of conflict with merchants. Businesses in Koreatown suffered extensive destruction. Many owners lost stores built through family savings and years of labour. They had little political influence and later described feeling ignored by both law enforcement and city leadership. The uprising spread beyond the original confrontation between black residents and police. Latino residents participated in looting and were also among the victims, workers, business owners, and people arrested. Violence reached neighbourhoods with different racial and economic populations. Some attacks were politically expressive. Others were opportunistic theft, personal violence, arson, or destruction, with no clear connection to the verdict. The term riot describes the lawlessness and physical destruction. The term uprising emphasises the political anger and historical grievances. Neither word captures every person's actions. Some residents protested peacefully. Some stole food, clothing, appliances, or alcohol. Some destroyed businesses owned by neighbours. Some protected stores. Some attacked strangers because of race. Some rescued strangers across racial lines. Some stayed inside and listened to the city burn. The unrest continued for several days. More than 60 people died, thousands were injured, and large areas suffered fire and property destruction. Estimates of the financial damage reached approximately $1 billion or more, depending on the source and method of calculation. Contemporary legal analysis commonly described around 60 deaths and nearly $1 billion in damage. State and federal forces were deployed after local response proved inadequate. The California National Guard entered the city, followed by federal troops and federal law enforcement personnel. The arrival of troops restored order gradually, but it also made parts of Los Angeles resemble the war zone residents had long accused police of imagining. Armed personnel stood at intersections. Curfews limited movement. Checkpoints and patrols controlled streets. Smoke covered sections of the city. The language of occupation was no longer metaphorical. The Watts Truce faced its first test immediately. The participating gangs largely maintained their ceasefire through the unrest. The destruction around them did not automatically return them to their old war. The agreement later encouraged additional peace efforts and attempts to create economic organisations such as Hands Across Watts. This did not mean gang violence disappeared after 1992. Some truces weakened. Individuals violated agreements. Economic investment failed to arrive at the scale participants expected. Older rivalries returned in some places and new disputes formed. The truce still revealed an important contradiction. City leaders often described gang members only as the cause of disorder. During the same period, some gang members were doing what official institutions had failed to do, negotiating local peace. Their argument was not that past crimes should be forgotten. It was that continued retaliation had produced nothing except more graves. The uprising forced Los Angeles to confront several failures at once. The police department had failed to build public trust and failed to prepare for the verdict. The courts had produced a decision much of the public could not reconcile with what it had seen. Political leaders had failed to address poverty, unemployment, housing inequality, and neighbourhood abandonment. The drug war had produced arrests without eliminating the market. The city had allowed relationships among black, Korean, Latino, and white communities to deteriorate while treating each conflict as separate from economic competition and political exclusion. Gang violence had damaged neighbourhoods so severely that residents sometimes depended on the same police department they distrusted. No single explanation could contain the events. The King verdict was the immediate trigger. The road to the intersection at Florence and Normandy had been built over decades. It ran through restrictive housing practices, factory closures, school inequality, police abuse, gang fragmentation, crack markets, aggressive raids, courtroom decisions, and thousands of personal losses that never became national stories. By the time the first fires were visible from television helicopters, the city was not reacting to one verdict alone. It was reacting to a history that had repeatedly been investigated, documented, discussed, and postponed. When order returned, officials would promise rebuilding. Businesses would reopen or disappear. families would bury the dead. Police leadership would change. Federal prosecutors would bring civil rights charges against the officers involved in the King beating. The gang truce would continue its uncertain experiment. South Central would acquire another layer of reputation that residents had to carry whenever they gave an address or described where they came from. The streets would look different after the burned buildings were cleared, but the most difficult question would remain the same. What happens to a neighbourhood after the cameras leave, when the violence that made it famous becomes history, but the people who survived it still have to live there? When the cameras left, the people who lived in South Central Los Angeles remained. They remained beside burned buildings and empty lots. They remained in apartments where smoke had entered through windows. They remained behind store counters, inside churches, in classrooms, and at kitchen tables where families tried to explain what had happened. The uprising ended, but ordinary life did not restart cleanly. People still needed food, medicine, transportation, work, and places to live. Children returned to schools carrying memories of fires, armed troops, and adults standing on rooftops with rifles. Employees discovered that the business where they had worked no longer existed. Shop owners arrived at properties that represented years of savings and found damaged walls, broken equipment, or nothing worth recovering. The destruction was often described through a total financial estimate, usually around $1 billion. That figure made the scale easier to report, but it did not show what the losses meant to individual families. A burned grocery store was not only a damaged building, it was the nearest place where elderly residents bought food. A destroyed pharmacy was not only lost inventory, it was where people filled prescriptions without travelling several miles. A ruined factory or warehouse was not only a commercial loss, it represented jobs in a neighbourhood already suffering from unemployment. More than 60 people had died during the unrest, thousands had been injured, and thousands of businesses and buildings were damaged or destroyed. Tens of thousands of workers may have lost employment temporarily or permanently as businesses closed. The people killed did not belong to one race or one category. Some died during confrontations with police or National Guard personnel. Some were shot by business owners or private citizens. Some were killed during robberies, assaults, or arguments. Others died in fires or accidents. The word riot placed them inside one event, but they had reached it through different circumstances. Families held funerals after public attention had moved toward rebuilding. For them, the uprising did not end when the curfew was lifted. It ended slowly, if it ended at all. A person who lost a brother at an intersection remembered that location differently from someone who had watched the same scene on television. A shopkeeper who lost a business remembered the smell of burned merchandise. A firefighter remembered entering streets where crews needed armed protection. A child remembered the expressions on adults' faces when the electricity went out or gunfire sounded nearby. The first response from political and business leaders was a promise to rebuild. The word sounded hopeful. It also suggested that South Central had been healthy before the fires and needed only physical repair. Residents knew that many of the problems were older than the destroyed buildings. A new storefront could not replace decades of lost industrial employment. A temporary loan program could not erase housing discrimination. A public statement about unity could not repair distrust among black residents, Korean American merchants, Latino communities, and the police. The streets needed reconstruction, but the deeper demand was investment. Rebuild LA became the most visible effort. Mayor Tom Bradley and Governor Pete Wilson selected Peter Ueberroth, the former Major League Baseball commissioner and organizer of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, to lead it. The organization sought corporate commitments, new businesses, jobs, training, and investment for affected neighborhoods. Announcements arrived quickly. Companies promised stores and employment. Banks discussed loans. Officials described the destruction as an opportunity to correct years of neglect. The promises were larger than the results. Rebuild LA reported hundreds of millions of dollars in commitments, but commitments did not always become completed projects. Some companies counted investments that had already been planned. Others faced a weak economy, insurance problems, land costs, permits, security concerns, and uncertainty about whether businesses would attract enough customers. The damaged areas did not wait in suspended animation while plans were negotiated. Empty buildings remained empty. Vacant lots collected rubbish. Small owners struggled to navigate insurance claims and city regulations. Only months after the unrest, reporting showed that permits for many of the most severely damaged structures were moving slowly because of financing obstacles, government procedures, and uncertainty among property owners. This delay affected how residents understood the promises. Officials had appeared quickly when the city was burning. Investment arrived more cautiously when the fires were out. The contrast was familiar. Police helicopters could be deployed immediately. A supermarket could take years. National Guard troops could occupy an intersection within days. A stable employer required studies, financing, permits, and confidence in future profits. South Central's poverty was not created by the uprising. Census information released soon afterward showed that the area had fallen behind the rest of Los Angeles County during the 1980s, and that family poverty was more severe than it had been around the time of the Watts Uprising in 1965. The population had also changed substantially, becoming increasingly Latino while remaining home to a large black community. That demographic change would shape the decades that followed. The term South Central had often been used nationally as shorthand for Black Los Angeles. By 1992, many neighborhoods contained Black and Latino families living beside one another, attending the same schools, competing for the same low-wage jobs, and facing many of the same housing problems. Shared conditions did not automatically produce unity. Language differences, immigration status, political representation, employment competition, and cultural misunderstanding could create tension. Some Latino residents felt ignored in public discussions that described the uprising entirely through black-white relations. Some black residents feared that their political influence was declining as the population changed. The city needed forms of cooperation that recognized both shared problems and different histories. Government agencies and community organizations attempted to reduce racial tension after the unrest. The Department of Justice's Community Relations Service worked with African American, Korean American, and Latino leaders, helped schools develop emergency plans, organized conflict resolution training, and supported communication between law enforcement and community representatives. These meetings could not replace what had been lost. They did, however, create spaces where people who had previously encountered one another, mainly through conflict, could speak directly. Korean American merchants described abandonment by the police and government. Black residents described years of disrespect in local stores and the anger surrounding Latasha Harlin's killing. Latino leaders described communities that had suffered violence and poverty while remaining largely absent from national reporting. Listening did not guarantee agreement. It made the simplified story harder to maintain. The uprising had not been a conflict involving only one community attacking another. It had been a collapse of public order inside a city divided by race, class, geography, and political power. The criminal cases connected to Rodney King continued. Federal prosecutors charged the four officers with violating King's civil rights. The federal trial began in 1993 under a different legal standard from the state prosecution. On April 17, 1993, a jury convicted Sergeant Stacy Kuhn and Officer Lawrence Powell. Officers Theodore Brasino and Timothy Wind were acquitted. Kuhn and Powell later received prison sentences of 30 months. King also won a civil judgment against the city of Los Angeles. The federal convictions gave some residents a measure of accountability. They did not resolve the larger problem. 2 officers had been convicted because one beating happened to be recorded. Countless earlier encounters had left no video. The question remained whether the department would change when no camera was present. Daryl Gates retired in 1992. Willie L. Williams became the first black chief of the LAPD. He inherited a department under intense scrutiny and a city that wanted several incompatible things at once. Residents wanted less abuse. They also wanted fewer shootings. Officers wanted public support. They also resisted reforms they believed would interfere with their safety or authority. Political leaders wanted visible change without appearing weak on crime. The Christopher Commission had already documented failures in discipline, supervision, and the handling of excessive force complaints. Reform now had an official foundation, but changing a police department involved more than replacing its chief. Training could be rewritten, complaint procedures could be revised, supervisors could be instructed to monitor problem officers. The attitudes developed through years of aggressive policing were harder to replace. The department's anti-gang units remained active because gang violence continued. Residents still called for help. Detectives still investigated murders. Patrol officers still entered situations involving armed suspects. Reform had to occur while the institution continued performing the work that had produced many of its most damaging habits. The gang truce offered another kind of change. The Watts Agreement reached among the Bounty Hunter Bloods, Grape Street Watts Crips, Hacienda Village Bloods, and P.J. Watts Crips had survived the first days of the uprising. Other peace efforts followed as former rivals met in parks, churches, housing developments, and community centres. The truce did not come from a sudden disappearance of anger. Participants had lost friends and relatives. Some had personally committed acts they could not undo. The neighbourhood still carried graffiti, memorials, and stories of old attacks. The agreement rested on a practical conclusion. Retaliation had failed. It had not restored the dead. It had not created security. It had not produced jobs, political influence, or respect. It had turned children into new participants in conflicts that adults no longer remembered clearly. Some members began presenting the truce as more than a ceasefire. They wanted investment, employment, recreation, education, and a greater voice in how their neighbourhoods were policed. They argued that the city should treat them as people capable of rebuilding, rather than only as targets for arrest. Police officials viewed parts of the movement with suspicion. They worried that gang unity could be directed against law enforcement or used to organise crime more effectively. That concern revealed how difficult it was for authorities to imagine gang members acting politically. The police had spent years learning to interpret gatherings as threats. A peace meeting could therefore appear to be a conspiracy. The truce produced real reductions in violence in some areas, even though it did not eliminate gang activity or include every set. Federal research later found that Los Angeles accounted for a substantial share of the national decrease in reported youth gang homicides between 1991 and 1996. No single cause explains that decline. The truce mattered. Changes in drug markets mattered. Demographic shifts mattered. Economic conditions, policing strategies, imprisonment, community intervention, and the exhaustion created by years of killing may all have contributed. The decline was uneven. Some neighbourhoods improved faster than others. Particular rivalries remained deadly. Peace agreements weakened when respected participants were killed, imprisoned, or moved away. Young people who had not experienced the worst years could revive old disputes without understanding why older members had agreed to stop. A truce required maintenance. Rumours had to be checked before they produced retaliation. A shooting had to be investigated socially as well as legally. Intervention workers needed to determine whether it was gang-related, personal, accidental, or falsely attributed to a rival set. Families had to be contacted. Angry friends had to be persuaded not to act. This work was performed by people whose names rarely appeared in crime statistics. Former gang members became intervention workers because they could enter spaces where police officers could not. They understood the importance of timing after a shooting. They knew which older member could influence younger people, and which person had a reputation but no real authority. Their credibility came from the same history that made outside institutions distrust them. A man with a criminal record might prevent a murder because young people believed him. The city had to decide whether to work with such people without pretending their past actions had not occurred. Over time, gang intervention became a more established part of violence reduction in Los Angeles. The idea that former members could serve as mediators grew partly from the peace efforts surrounding 1992. Later accounts of the uprising's legacy noted that although the original Watts Truce did not remain intact in every form, it helped establish a continuing role for interventionists working to prevent retaliatory violence. The homicide decline changed daily life gradually. There was no morning when residents woke and declared that the worst period had ended. A mother allowed a child to stay outside slightly later. A store remained open after dark. A school stopped expecting a particular rivalry to produce a fight every week. People noticed that fewer funerals involved teenagers. Then another shooting occurred and reminded everyone that improvement did not mean safety. The peak years left physical and emotional habits behind. Adults continued checking cars that slowed near the house. People still avoided certain blocks because the old map remained in memory. Former members carried injuries and prison records. Parents raised grandchildren because their own children had died or been incarcerated. A lower annual homicide total did not restore the people already lost. The police department's problems also continued beyond the King case. Near the end of the 1990s, the Rampart scandal exposed corruption and abuse inside an anti-gang unit operating from the Rampart division. Investigations connected officers to false testimony, planted evidence, unjustified shootings, theft, and other misconduct. Convictions were overturned, lawsuits followed, and public confidence suffered another serious blow. The scandal demonstrated that the concerns raised before and after 1992 had not been solved by a new chief or revised policies. Specialised units still operated with limited supervision. Officers still received incentives for arrests and gang intelligence. Communities still struggled to challenge official accounts. The federal government eventually imposed oversight through a consent decree intended to reform use of force procedures, discipline, supervision, and accountability. The police department did change in important ways over the following years. Civilian oversight expanded, data collection improved, community policing language became more common. The department placed greater emphasis on constitutional policing and relationships with residents. The results remained debated. Some residents developed better relationships with individual officers. Others continued to experience stops, searches, and force as part of daily life. Institutional reform could improve procedure without erasing memory. A person beaten by police in 1988 did not feel repaired because a policy changed in 2002. The name of the area changed as well. In 2003, the Los Angeles City Council officially replaced the name South Central Los Angeles with South Los Angeles. Supporters hoped the change would separate the community from decades of national associations with gangs, drugs, fires, and riots. The new name appeared on signs and official documents. Residents did not all adopt it immediately. A place cannot be rebranded as easily as a company. For some people, South Central remained a name connected to home, music, political struggle, family, and cultural identity. For others, it had become a label imposed by news reports that treated the area as a permanent crime scene. South Los Angeles offered a different description. It did not remove the old reputation. The neighborhood continued changing. Latino immigration reshaped commercial streets, churches, schools, and political life. Black families moved to other parts of Los Angeles County, the Inland Empire, and beyond, often searching for affordable housing and safer communities. Rising housing costs later created new pressures. Properties once neglected became attractive to investors as development expanded around transit lines and nearby neighborhoods. The threat of abandonment was joined by the threat of displacement. Residents who had remained through the worst years now worried that improvement would make the area too expensive for them. A new cafe or apartment development could represent investment. It could also signal that rents were about to rise. This was another version of an old Los Angeles problem. Communities were denied resources while they were poor, and then threatened with removal when resources finally arrived. The history of Hell's Half Acre therefore did not end with a gang truce or a decline in homicide. It continued through who received loans, who owned property which schools improved, how police used authority, and whether young people could imagine a future that did not require leaving their neighbourhood. The most dramatic years produced famous images. Rodney King on the pavement, smoke rising above the city, Reginald Denny beside his truck, Korean-American merchants on rooftops, National Guard vehicles at intersections. Those images matter, but they can distort the history if they become the whole story. Most people who lived through the period were never recorded. No camera followed the nurse who returned to work after her apartment building was damaged. No helicopter filmed the minister mediating between rival sets. No national broadcast showed the grandmother taking 3 children into her home, because their parents could no longer care for them. No famous photograph captured a teenager choosing not to retaliate after his friend was killed. History often remembers the gunfire because gunfire is visible. Survival is quieter. The people who stayed rebuilt homes, reopened businesses, organised schools, negotiated truces, challenged police misconduct, and carried families through grief. They did not solve every problem. They disagreed about what the neighbourhood needed. Some wanted more police, others wanted fewer. Some believed economic development was the answer. Others focused on education, treatment, gun control, family stability, or community authority. Most understood that no single solution would be enough. The violence had been produced by several systems operating together. The response had to be larger than an arrest campaign. A safe street required people willing to prevent shootings. It required police capable of solving crimes without treating every resident as an enemy. It required witnesses who believed cooperation would not place them in greater danger. It required schools that could keep young people engaged. It required employment that paid enough to make legal work credible. It required treatment for addiction. It required housing stable enough for families to remain connected. It required time. That may be the most important fact left after the gunfire. Destruction can happen in minutes. A car turns onto a street. Several shots are fired. A store catches fire. A jury announces a verdict. A crowd changes direction. Repair occurs through decisions repeated for years. A former gang member answers a telephone before retaliation begins. A teacher keeps a student in school. A detective earns the trust of a witness. A business owner returns. A family stays. The district described as Hell's Half Acre was never only a dangerous place. It was a place made dangerous by decisions involving housing, employment, drugs, guns, gangs, policing, and political neglect. It was also a place where people resisted those conditions long before the rest of the country noticed them. The title encourages us to imagine a territory consumed by violence, where every street belonged to gangs and every resident lived outside ordinary society. That was never true. The majority of residents were ordinary people carrying an extraordinary burden. They lived inside a national symbol and still had to perform the smallest tasks of daily life. They prepared breakfast. They sent children to school. They waited for buses. They attended funerals. They opened stores. They listened for gunfire. They called the police and worried about what would happen when the police arrived. Years later, crime statistics could show that the number of killings had fallen. Reports could describe reform, redevelopment, and demographic change. Those measurements were important. They could not show how long it took for a person to stop dropping to the floor when a car backfired. They could not show how a mother felt when her son reached an age his older brother had never reached. They could not show what it meant to walk across a street that had once been an invisible border and realise that no one was watching. The old map did not disappear all at once. It faded. Some lines remained, some returned. Others survived only in stories told by people who remembered when crossing them could cost a life. And somewhere in South Los Angeles, on a street that once appeared every night in police reports, someone eventually stood outside after sunset without thinking about which set claimed the block. A car passed. Nobody moved toward the floor. Children continued playing. The moment was too ordinary to record. That was what made it important.